Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. It was love at first sight. The first time Yossarian saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him. Yossarian was in the hospital with a pain in his liver that fell just short of being jaundice. The doctors were puzzled by the fact that it wasn't quite jaundice. If it became jaundice, they could treat it. If it didn't become jaundice and went away, they could discharge him. But this being just short of jaundice all the time confused them. Each morning they came around, three brisk and serious men with efficient mouths and inefficient eyes, accompanied by brisk and serious Nurse Duckett, one of the ward nurses who didn't like Yossarian. They read the chart at the foot of the bed and asked him patiently about the pain. They seemed irritated when he told them it was exactly the same. Still no movement? The full colonel demanded. The doctors exchanged a look when he shook his head. I'll give another pill. Nurse Duckett made a note to give Yossarian another pill, and the four of them moved along to the next bed. None of the nurses liked Yossarian. Actually, the pain in his liver had gone away, but Yossarian didn't say anything, and the doctors never suspected. They just suspected that he'd been moving his bowels and not telling anyone. Yossarian had everything he wanted in the hospital. The food wasn't too bad, and his meals were brought to him in bed. There were extra rations of fresh meat, and during the hot part of the afternoon, he and the others were served chilled fruit juice or chilled chocolate milk. Apart from the doctors and the nurses, no one ever disturbed him. For a little while in the morning, he had to censor letters, but he was free after that to spend the rest of each day lying around idly with a clear conscience. He was comfortable in the hospital, and it was easy to stay on because he always ran a temperature of 101. He was even more comfortable than Dunbar, who had to keep falling down on his face in order to get his meals brought to him in bed. After he had made up his mind to spend the rest of the war in the hospital, Yossarian wrote letters to everyone he knew saying that he was in the hospital but never mentioned why. One day he had a better idea. To everyone he knew, he wrote that he was going on a very dangerous mission. They asked for volunteers. It's very dangerous, but someone has to do it. I'll write you the instant I get back. And he had not written anyone since. All the officer patients in the ward were forced to censor letters written by all the enlisted men patients who were kept in residence and wards of their own. It was a monotonous job, and Yossarian was disappointed to learn that the lives of enlisted men were only slightly more interesting than the lives of officers. After the first day, he had no curiosity at all. To break the monotony, he invented games. Death to all modifiers, he declared one day, and out of every letter that passed through his hands went every adverb and every adjective. The next day, he made war on articles. He reached a much higher plane of creativity the following day when he blacked out everything in the letters but A, and V. That erected more dynamic interlinear tensions, he felt, and in just about every case left a message far more universal. Soon he was prescribing parts of salutations and signatures and leaving the text untouched. One time he blacked out all but the salutation Dear Mary from a letter, and at the bottom he wrote, I yearn for you tragically. R.O. Shipman, Chaplain, U.S. Army. R.O. Shipman was the group chaplain's name. When he had exhausted all possibilities in the letters, he began attacking the names and addresses on the envelopes, obliterating whole homes and streets, annihilating entire metropolises with careless flicks of his wrist as though he were God. Catch-22 required that each censored letter bear the censoring officer's name. Most letters he didn't read at all. On those he didn't read at all, he wrote his own name. On those he did read, he wrote Washington Irving. When that grew monotonous, he wrote Irving Washington. Censoring the envelopes had serious repercussions, produced a ripple of anxiety on some ethereal military echelon that floated a CID man back into the ward posing as a patient. They all knew he was a CID man because he kept inquiring about an officer named Irving or Washington, and because after his first day there he wouldn't censor letters. He found them too monotonous. It was a good ward this time, one of the best he and Dunbar had ever enjoyed. With them this time was the 24-year-old fighter pilot captain with a sparse golden mustache who'd been shot into the Adriatic Sea in midwinter and not even caught cold. Now the summer was upon them. The captain had not been shot down, and he said he had the grip. In the bed on Yossarian's right, still lying amorously on his belly, was the startled captain with malaria in his blood and a mosquito bite on his ass. Across the aisle from Yossarian was Dunbar, and next to Dunbar was the artillery captain with whom Yossarian had stopped playing chess. The captain was a good chess player, and the games were always interesting. Yossarian had stopped playing chess with him because the games were so interesting they were foolish. Then there was the educated Texan from Texas, who looked like someone in Technicolor and felt patriotically that people of means, decent folk, should be given more votes than drifters, whores, criminals, degenerates, atheists, and indecent folk, people without means. Yossarian was unspringing rhythms in the letters this day they brought the Texan in. It was another quiet, hot, untroubled day. The heat pressed heavily on the roof, stifling sound. Dunbar was lying motionless on his back again, with his eyes staring up at the ceiling like a doll's. He was working hard at increasing his lifespan. He did it by cultivating boredom. Dunbar was working so hard at increasing his lifespan that Yossarian thought he was dead. They put the Texan in a bed in the middle of the ward, and it wasn't long before he donated his views. Dunbar sat up like a shot. "That's it," he cried excitedly. "There was something missing. All the time I knew there was something missing, and now I know what it is." He banged his fist down into his palm. "No patriotism," he declared. "You're right," Yossarian shouted back. "You're right, you're right, you're right. The hot dog, the Brooklyn Dodgers, Mom's apple pie, that's what everybody's fighting for. But who's fighting for the decent folk? Who's fighting for more votes for the decent folk? There's no patriotism, that's what it is, and no matriotism either." The warrant officer on Yossarian's left was unimpressed. "Who gives a shit?" he asked tiredly, and turned over on his side to go to sleep. The Texan turned out to be good-natured, generous, and likable. In 3 days, nobody could stand him. He sent shudders of annoyance scampering up ticklish spines, and everybody fled from him. Everybody but the soldier in white, who had no choice. The soldier in white was encased from head to toe in plaster and gauze. He had 2 useless legs and 2 useless arms. He had been smuggled into the ward during the night, and the men had no idea he was among them until they awoke in the morning and saw the 2 strange legs hoisted from the hips, the 2 strange arms anchored up perpendicularly, all 4 limbs pinioned strangely in air by lead weights suspended darkly above him that never moved. Sewn into the bandages over the insides of both elbows were zippered lips through which he was fed clear fluid from a clear jar. A silent zinc pipe rose from the cement on his groin and was coupled to a slim rubber hose that carried waste from his kidneys and dripped it efficiently into a clear, stoppered jar on the floor. When the jar on the floor was full, the jar feeding his elbow was empty, and the two were simply switched quickly so that the stuff could drip back into him. All they ever really saw of the soldier in white was a frayed black hole over his mouth. The soldier in white had been filed next to the Texan, and the Texan sat sideways on his own bed and talked to him throughout the morning, afternoon, and evening in a pleasant, sympathetic drawl. The Texan never minded that he got no reply. Temperatures were taken twice a day in the ward. Early each morning and late each afternoon, Nurse Kramer entered with a jar full of thermometers and worked her way up one side of the ward and down the other, distributing a thermometer to each patient. She managed the soldier in white by inserting a thermometer into the hole over his mouth and leaving it balanced there on the lower rim. When she returned to the man in the first bed, she took his thermometer and recorded his temperature, and then moved on to the next bed and continued around the ward again. One afternoon, when she completed her first circuit of the ward and came a second time to a soldier in white, she read his thermometer and discovered that he was dead. "Murderer," Dunbar said quietly. The Texan looked up at him with an uncertain grin. "Killer," Yossarian said. "What are you fellas talking about?" the Texan asked nervously. "You murdered him," said Dunbar. "You killed him," said Yossarian. The Texan shrank back. "You fellas are crazy. I didn't even touch him." "You murdered him," said Dunbar. "I heard you kill him," said Yossarian. "You killed him because he was a nigger," Dunbar said. "You fellas are crazy," the Texan cried. "They don't allow niggers in here. They got a special place for niggers." "The sergeant smuggled him in," Dunbar said. "The communist sergeant," said Yossarian. "And you knew it." The warrant officer on Yossarian's left was unimpressed by the entire incident of the soldier in white. The warrant officer was unimpressed by everything and never spoke at all unless it was to show irritation. The day before Yossarian met the chaplain, a stove exploded in the mess hall and set fire to one side of the kitchen. An intense heat flashed through the area. Even in Yossarian's ward, almost 300 feet away, they could hear the roar of the blaze and the sharp cracks of flaming timber. Smoke sped past the orange-tinted windows. In about 15 minutes, the crash trucks from the airfield arrived to fight the fire. For a frantic half hour, it was touch and go. Then the firemen began to get the upper hand. Suddenly, there was the monotonous old drone of bombers returning from a mission, and the firemen had to roll up their hoses and speed back to the field in case one of the planes crashed and caught fire. The planes landed safely. As soon as the last one was down, the firemen wheeled their trucks around and raced back up the hill to resume their fight with the fire at the hospital. When they got there, the blaze was out. It had died of its own accord, expired completely without even an ember to be watered down, and there was nothing for the disappointed firemen to do but drink tepid coffee and hang around trying to screw the nurses. The chaplain arrived the day after the fire. Yossarian was busy expurgating all but romance words from the letters when the chaplain sat down in a chair between the beds and asked him how he was feeling. He had placed himself a bit to one side, and the captain's bars on the tab of his shirt collar were all the insignia Yossarian could see. Yossarian had no idea who he was, and he just took it for granted that he was either another doctor or another madman. "Oh, pretty good," he answered. "I got a slight pain in my liver, and I haven't been the most regular of fellows, I guess, but all in all, I must admit that I feel pretty good." "That's good," said the chaplain. "Yes," Yossarian said. "Yes, that is good." "I meant to come around sooner," the chaplain said, but I really haven't been well." "Oh, that's too bad," Yossarian said. "Well, it's just a head cold," the chaplain added quickly. "I've got a fever of 101," Yossarian added just as quickly. "That's too bad," said the chaplain. "Yes," Yossarian agreed. "Yes, that is too bad." The chaplain fidgeted. Is there anything I can do for you?" he asked after a while. "No, no," Yossarian sighed. "The doctors are doing all that's humanly possible, I suppose." "No, no," the chaplain colored faintly. I didn't mean anything like that. I meant cigarettes or books or toys." "No, no," Yossarian said. "Thank you. I have everything I need, I suppose. Everything but good health." "That's too bad." "Yes," Yossarian said. "Yes, that is too bad." The chaplain stirred again. He looked from side to side a few times, then gazed up at the ceiling, then down at the floor. He drew a deep breath. "Lieutenant Nately sends his regards," he said. Yossarian was sorry to hear that they had a mutual friend. It seemed there was a basis to their conversation after all. "You know Lieutenant Nately?" he asked regretfully. "Yes, I know Lieutenant Nately quite well." "He's a bit lonely, isn't he?" The chaplain's smile was embarrassed. "I'm afraid I couldn't say. I don't think I know him that well." "Well, you can take my word for it," Yossarian said. "He's as goofy as they come." The chaplain weighed the next silence heavily and then shattered it with an abrupt question. "You are Captain Yossarian, aren't you?" "Nately had a bad start. He came from a good family." Please excuse me," the chaplain persisted timorously. I may be committing a very grave error. Are you Captain Yossarian?" "Yes," Captain Yossarian confessed. I am Captain Yossarian." "Of the 256th Squadron?" "Of the fighting 256th Squadron," Yossarian replied. "I didn't know there were any other Captain Yossarians. As far as I know, I'm the only Captain Yossarian I know, but that's only as far as I know." "I see," the chaplain said unhappily. "That's two to the fighting eighth power," Yossarian pointed out, "if you're thinking of writing a symbolic poem about our squadron." "No," mumbled the chaplain, "I am not thinking of writing a symbolic poem about your squadron." Yossarian straightened sharply when he spied the tiny silver cross on the other side of the chaplain's collar. He was thoroughly astonished, for he had never really talked with a chaplain before. "You're a chaplain!" he exclaimed ecstatically. "I didn't know you were a chaplain." "Why, yes," the chaplain answered. "Didn't you know I was a chaplain?" "Why, no, I didn't know you were a chaplain." Yossarian stared at him with a big, fascinated grin. "I've never really seen a chaplain before." The chaplain flushed again and gazed down at his hands. He was a slight man of about 32, with tan hair and brown, diffident eyes. His face was narrow and rather pale. An innocent nest of ancient pimple pricks lay in the basin of each cheek. Yossarian wanted to help him. "Can I do anything at all to help you?" the chaplain asked. Yossarian shook his head, still grinning. "No, I'm sorry. I have everything I need, and I'm quite comfortable. In fact, I'm not even sick." "Oh, that's good." As soon as the chaplain said the words, he was sorry and shoved his knuckles into his mouth with a giggle of alarm, but Yossarian remained silent and disappointed him. "There are other men in the group I must visit," he apologized finally. "I'll come and see you again, probably tomorrow." "Oh, please do that," Yossarian said. "I'll come only if you want me to," the chaplain said, lowering his head shyly. "I've noticed that I make many of the men uncomfortable." Yossarian glowed with affection. "I want you to," he said. "You won't make me uncomfortable." The chaplain beamed gratefully and then peered down at a slip of paper he had been concealing in his hand all the while. He counted along the beds in the ward, moving his lips, and then centered his attention dubiously on Dunbar. May, may I inquire," he whispered softly, "if that is Lieutenant Dunbar?" "Yes," Yossarian answered loudly. "That is Lieutenant Dunbar." "Thank you," the chaplain whispered. "Thank you very much. I must visit with him. I must visit with every member of the group who is in the hospital." "Even those in the other wards?" Yossarian asked. "Even those in the other wards." "Be careful in those other wards, Father," Yossarian warned. "That's where they keep the mental cases. They're filled with lunatics." It isn't necessary to call me father, the chaplain explained. I'm an Anabaptist. I'm dead serious about those other wards, Yossarian continued grimly. MPs won't protect you because they're the craziest of all. I go with you myself, but I'm scared stiff. Insanity is contagious, you know. This is the only sane ward in the whole hospital. Everybody is crazy but us. This is probably the only sane ward in the whole world, for that matter. The chaplain rose quickly and edged away from Yossarian's bed, and then nodded with a conciliating smile and promised to conduct himself with appropriate caution. And now I must visit with Lieutenant Dunbar, he said. Still he lingered, remorsefully. How is Lieutenant Dunbar? He asked at last. As good as they go, Yossarian assured him. A true prince. One of the finest, least dedicated men in the whole world. No, I didn't mean that, the chaplain answered, whispering again. Is he very sick? No, he isn't very sick. In fact, he isn't sick at all. Oh, that's good, the chaplain sighed with relief. Yes, Yossarian said. Yes, that is good. A chaplain, Dunbar said when the chaplain had visited him and gone. Did you see that? A chaplain. Wasn't he sweet? Said Yossarian. Maybe they should give him 3 votes. Who's they? Dunbar demanded suspiciously. In a bed in the small private section at the end of the ward, always working ceaselessly behind a green plyboard partition, was the solemn middle-aged colonel who was visited every day by a gentle, sweet-faced woman with curly, ash-blonde hair, who was not a nurse and not a whack, and not a Red Cross girl, but who nevertheless appeared faithfully at the hospital in Pianosa each afternoon, wearing pretty pastel summer dresses that were very smart, and white leather pumps with heels half high at the base of nylon seams that were inevitably straight. The colonel was in communications, and he was kept busy day and night transmitting glutinous messages from the interior into square pads of gauze, which he sealed meticulously and delivered to a covered white pail that stood on the night table beside his bed. The colonel was gorgeous. He had a cavernous mouth, cavernous cheeks, cavernous, sad, mildewed eyes. His face was the color of clouded silver. He coughed quietly, gingerly, and dabbed the pad slowly at his lips with a distaste that had become automatic. The colonel dwelt in a vortex of specialists who were still specializing in trying to determine what was troubling him. They hurled lights in his eyes to see if he could see, rammed needles into nerves to hear if he could feel. There was a urologist for his urine, a lymphologist for his lymph, an endocrinologist for his endocrines, a psychologist for his psyche, a dermatologist for his derma. There was a pathologist for his pathos, a cystologist for his cysts, and a bald and pedantic cetologist from the zoology department at Harvard who had been shanghaied ruthlessly into the medical corps by a faulty anode in an IBM machine and spent his sessions with the dying colonel trying to discuss Moby Dick with him. The colonel had really been investigated. There was not an organ of his body that had not been drugged and derogated, dusted and dredged, fingered and photographed, removed, plundered and replaced. Neat, slender and erect, the woman touched him often as she sat by his bedside and was the epitome of stately sorrow each time she smiled. The colonel was tall, thin, and stooped. When he rose to walk, he bent forward even more, making a deep cavity of his body, and placed his feet down very carefully, moving ahead by inches from the knees down. There were violet pools under his eyes. The woman spoke softly, softer than the colonel coughed, and none of the men in the ward ever heard her voice. In less than 10 days, the Texan cleared the ward. The artillery captain broke first, and after that the exodus started. Dunbar, Yossarian, and the fighter captain all bolted the same morning. Dunbar stopped having dizzy spells, and the fighter captain blew his nose. Yossarian told the doctors that the pain in his liver had gone away. It was as easy as that. Even the warrant officer fled. In less than 10 days, the Texan drove everybody in the ward back to duty. Everybody but the CID man who had caught cold from the fighter captain and came down with pneumonia. In a way, the CID man was pretty lucky because outside the hospital, the war was still going on. Men went mad and were rewarded with medals. All over the world, boys on every side of the bomb line were laying down their lives for what they had been told was their country, and no one seemed to mind, least of all the boys who were laying down their young lives. There was no end in sight. The only end in sight was Yossarian's own, and he might have remained in the hospital until doomsday had it not been for the patriotic Texan with his infundibuliform jowls and his lumpy, rumple-headed, indestructible smile cracked forever across the front of his face like the brim of a black 10-gallon hat. The Texan wanted everybody in the ward to be happy, except Yossarian and Dunbar. He was really very sick. But Yossarian couldn't be happy, even though the Tex didn't want him to be. because outside the hospital there was still nothing funny going on. The only thing going on was a war, and no one seemed to notice but Yossarian and Dunbar. And when Yossarian tried to remind people, they drew away from him and thought he was crazy. Even Clevenger, who should have known better but didn't, had told him he was crazy the last time they had seen each other, which was just before Yossarian had fled into the hospital. Clevenger had stared at him with apoplectic rage and indignation, and clawing the table with both hands, had shouted, "You're crazy!" "Clevenger, what do you want from people?" Dunbar had replied wearily above the noises of the officers' club. "I'm not joking," Clevenger persisted. "They're trying to kill me," Yossarian told him calmly. "No one's trying to kill you," Clevenger cried. "Then why are they shooting at me?" Yossarian asked. "They're shooting at everyone," Clevenger answered. "They're trying to kill everyone." "And what difference does that make?" Clevenger was already on the way, half out of his chair with emotion, his eyes moist and his lips quivering and pale. As always occurred when he quarreled over principles in which he believed passionately, he would end up gasping furiously for air and blinking back bitter tears of conviction. There were many principles in which Clevenger believed passionately. He was crazy. "Who's they?" he wanted to know. "Who specifically do you think is trying to murder you?" "Every one of them," Yossarian told him. "Every one of whom?" "Every one of whom do you think?" "I haven't any idea." "Then how do you know they aren't?" "Because—" Clevenger sputtered and turned speechless with frustration. Clevenger really thought he was right, but Yossarian had proof, because strangers he didn't know shot at him with cannons every time he flew up into the air to drop bombs on him. And it wasn't funny at all. And if that wasn't funny, there were lots of things that weren't even funnier. There was nothing funny about living like a bum in a tent in Pianosa between fat mountains behind him and a placid blue sea in front that could gulp down a person with a cramp in the twinkling of an eye and ship him back to shore 3 days later, all charges paid, bloated, blue and putrescent, water draining out through both cold nostrils. The tent he lived in stood right smack up against the wall of the shallow, dull-colored forest separating his own squadron from Dunbar's. Immediately alongside was the abandoned railroad ditch that carried the aviation gasoline down to the fuel trunks of the airfield. Thanks to Orr, his roommate, it was the most luxurious tent in the squadron. Each time Yossarian returned from one of his holidays in a hospital or rest leave in Rome, he was surprised by some new comfort Orr had installed in his absence. Running water, wood-burning fireplace, cement floor. Yossarian had chosen the site, and he and Orr had raised the tent together. Orr, who was a grinning pygmy with pilot's wings and thick, wavy brown hair parted in the middle, furnished all the knowledge, while Yossarian, who was taller, stronger, broader, and faster, did most of the work. Just the two of them lived there, although the tent was big enough for six. When summer came, Orr rolled up the side flaps to allow a breeze that never blew to flush away the baking air inside. Immediately next door to Yossarian was Havemeyer, who liked peanut brittle, and lived all by himself in the two-man tent in which he shot tiny field mice every night with huge bullets from a .45. On the other side of Havemeyer stood the tent McWatt no longer shared with Clevenger, who had still not returned when Yossarian came out of the hospital. McWatt shared his tent now with Nately, who was away in Rome courting the sleepy whore he had fallen so deeply in love with, who was bored with her work and bored with him too. McWatt was crazy. He was a pilot and flew his plane as low as he dared over Yossarian's tent as often as he could, just to see how much he could frighten him, and loved to go buzzing with a wild, close roar over the wooden raft floating on empty oil drums out past the sandbar at the immaculate white beach where the men went swimming naked. Sharing a tent with a man who was crazy wasn't easy, but Nately didn't care. He was crazy too, and had gone every free day to work on the officers' club that Yossarian had not helped to build. Actually, there were many officers' clubs that Yossarian had not helped build, but he was proudest of the one in Pianosa. It was a sturdy and complex monument to his powers of determination. Yossarian never went there to help until it was finished. Then he went there often, so pleased was he with the large, fine, rambling, shingled building. It was truly a splendid structure, and Yossarian throbbed with a mighty sense of accomplishment each time he gazed at it and reflected that none of the work that had gone into it was his. There were four of them seated together at a table in the officers' club the last time he and Clevenger had called each other crazy. They were seated in back near the crap table on which Appleby always managed to win. Appleby was as good at shooting crap as he was at playing ping pong, and he was as good at playing ping pong as he was at everything else. Everything Appleby did, he did well. Appleby was a fair-haired boy from Iowa who believed in God, motherhood, and the American way of life without ever thinking about any of them, and everyone who knew him liked him. I hate that son of a bitch, Yossarian growled. The argument with Clevenger had begun a few minutes earlier, when Yossarian had been unable to find a machine gun. It was a busy night. The bar was busy, the crap table was busy, the ping pong table was busy. The people Yossarian wanted the machine gun were busy at the bar, singing sentimental old favorites that nobody else ever tired of. Instead of machine gunning them, he brought his heel down hard on the ping pong ball that came rolling toward him off the paddle of one of the two officers playing. Ha ha ha, that Yossarian! The two officers laughed, shaking their heads, and got another ball from the box on the shelf. That Yossarian answered them. Yossarian, Nately whispered cautiously. See what I mean? Asked Clevenger. The two officers laughed again when they heard Yossarian mimicking them. That Yossarian, they said more loudly. Yeah, that Yossarian echoed. Yossarian, please, Nately pleaded. You see what I mean? Asked Clevenger. He has antisocial aggressions. Ah, shut up, Dunbar told Clevenger. Dunbar liked Clevenger because Clevenger annoyed him and made the time go slow. Appleby isn't even here, Clevenger pointed out triumphantly to Yossarian. Who said anything about Appleby? Yossarian wanted to know. Colonel Cathcart isn't here either. Who said anything about Colonel Cathcart? What son of a bitch do you hate, then? What son of a bitch is here? I'm not going to argue with you, Clevenger decided. You don't know who you hate. Whoever's trying to poison me, Yossarian told him. Nobody's trying to poison you. They poisoned my food twice, didn't they? Didn't they put poison in my food during Ferrara and during the great big siege of Bologna? They put poison in everybody's food, Clevenger explained. And what difference does that make? And it wasn't even poison, Clevenger cried heatedly, growing more emphatic as he grew more confused. As far back as Yossarian could recall, he explained to Clevenger with a patient smile, somebody was always hatching a plot to kill him. There were people who cared for him and people who didn't, and those who didn't hated him and were out to get him. They hated him because he was a Syrian. But they couldn't touch him, he told Clevenger, because he had a sound mind and a pure body and was as strong as an ox. They couldn't touch him because he was Tarzan, Mandrake, and Flash Gordon. He was Bill Shakespeare. He was Cain, Ulysses, the Flying Dutchman. He was Latin Sodom, Deirdre of the Sorrows, Sweeney and the Nightingales among trees. He was Miracle Ingredient Z247. He was crazy, Clevenger interrupted, shrieking. That's what you are! Crazy! Immense. I'm a real slam bang, honest to goodness, three-fisted humdinger. I'm a bona fide Superman. Superman? Clevenger cried. Superman? Superman, Yossarian corrected. Hey, fellas, cut it out, Nately begged with embarrassment. Everybody's looking at us. You're crazy, Clevenger shouted vehemently, his eyes filling with tears. You got a Jehovah complex. I think everyone is Nathaniel. Clevenger arrested himself in mid-declamation suspiciously. Who's Nathaniel? Nathaniel who? Inquired Yossarian innocently. Clevenger skirted the trap neatly. You think everybody's Jehovah. You're no better than Raskolnikov. Who? Yes, Raskolnikov, who? Raskolnikov? Who, I mean it, who felt he could justify killing an old woman. No better than? Yes. Yes, justify. That's right, with an X. And I can prove it to you. Gasping furiously for air, Clevenger enumerated Yossarian's symptoms. An unreasonable belief that everyone around him was crazy, a homicidal impulse to machine gun strangers, retrospective falsification, an unfounded suspicion that people hated him and were conspiring to kill him. But Yossarian knew he was right, because as he explained to Clevenger, to the best of his knowledge, he had never been wrong. Everywhere he looked was a nut, and it was all a sensible young gentleman like himself could do to maintain his perspective amid so much madness. And it was urgent that he did, for he knew that his life was in peril. Yossarian eyed everyone he saw warily when he returned to the squadron from the hospital. Milo was away too in Smyrna for the fig harvest. The mess hall ran smoothly in Milo's absence. Yossarian had responded ravenously to the pungent aroma of spicy lamb while he was still in the cab of the ambulance bouncing down along the knotted road that lay like a broken suspender between the hospital and the squadron. There was shish kebab for lunch, huge, savory hunks of spitted meat, sizzling like the devil over charcoal after marinating 72 hours in a secret mixture Milo had stolen from a crooked trader in the Levant, served with Iranian rice and asparagus tips parmesan, followed by cherries jubilee for dessert, and then steaming cups of fresh coffee with Benedictine and brandy. The meal was served in enormous helpings on damask tablecloths by the skilled Italian waiters Major de Coverley had kidnapped from the mainland and given to Milo. Yossarian gorged himself in the mess hall, until he thought he would explode, and then sagged back in a contented stupor, his mouth filmy with a succulent residue. None of the officers in the squadron had ever eaten so well as they ate regularly in Milo's mess hall, and Yossarian wondered a while if it wasn't perhaps all worth it. But then he burped and remembered that they were trying to kill him, and he sprinted out of the mess hall wildly and ran looking for Dr. Nika to have himself taken off combat duty and sent home. He found Dr. Nika in the sunlight sitting in a high stool outside his tent. 50 missions, Dr. Nika told him, shaking his head. The colonel wants 50 missions, but I've only got 44. Dr. Nika was unmoved. He was a sad, bird-like man with a spatulate face and scrubbed, tapering features of a well-groomed rat. 50 missions, he repeated, still shaking his head. The colonel wants 50 missions. There was no enthusiasm in Yossarian's group. In Yossarian's group, there was only a mounting number of enlisted men and officers who found their way solemnly to Sergeant Towser several times a day to ask if the orders sending them home had come in. They were men who had finished their 50 missions. There were more of them now than when Yossarian had gone into the hospital, and they were still waiting. They worried and they bit their nails. They were grotesque, like useless young men in a depression. They moved sideways like crabs. They were waiting for the orders sending them home to safely return from 27th Air Force headquarters in Italy. And while they waited, they had nothing to do but worry and bite their nails and find their way solemnly to Sergeant Towser several times a day to ask if the orders sending them home to safety had come. They were in a race, and they knew it, because they knew from bitter experience that Colonel Cathcart might raise the number of missions again at any time. They had nothing better to do than wait. Havemeyer was a lead bombardier who never missed. Yossarian was the lead bombardier who had been demoted because he no longer gave a damn whether he missed or not. He had decided to live forever or die in the attempt, and his only mission each time he went up was to come down alive. The men had loved flying behind Yossarian, who used to come barreling in over the target from all directions and every height, climbing and diving and twisting and turning so steeply and sharply that it was all the pilots of the other 5 planes could do to stay in formation with him, leveling out only for the 2 or 3 seconds it took for the bombs to drop, and then zooming off again with an aching howl of engines and wrenching his flight through the air so violently as he wove his way through the filthy barrages of flak that the 6 planes were soon flung out all over the sky like prayers, each one a pushover for the German fighters, which was just fine with Yossarian, for there were no German fighters anymore, and he did not want any exploding planes near his when they did explode. Only when all the Sturm and Drang had been left far behind would he tip his flak helmet back wearily on his sweating head and stop barking directions to McWatt at the controls, who had nothing better to wonder about at a time like that than where the bombs had fallen. "Bombay clear," Sergeant Knight in the back would announce. "Did we hit the bridge?" McWatt would ask. "I couldn't see, sir. I kept getting bounced around back here pretty hard and I couldn't see. Everything's covered with smoke now and I can't see." "Hey, Arfie, did the bombs hit the target?" "What target?" Captain Aardvark, Yossarian's plump, pipe-smoking navigator, would say from the confusion of maps he had created at Yossarian's side and the nose of the ship. "I don't think we're at the target yet, are we?" "Yossarian, did the bombs hit the target?" "What bombs?" answered Yossarian, whose only concern had been the flak. "Oh, well," McBrock would sing, "what the hell?" Yossarian did not give a damn whether he hit the target or not, just as long as Havemeyer or one of the other lead bombardiers did, and they never had to go back. Every now and then someone grew angry enough at Havemeyer to throw a punch at him. "I said you men leave Captain Havemeyer alone," Colonel Cathcart warned them all angrily. "I said he's the best damn bombardier we got, didn't I?" Havemeyer grinned at the colonel's intervention and shoved another piece of peanut brittle inside his face. Havemeyer had grown very proficient at shooting field mice at night with the 45. His bait was a bar of candy, and he would pre-sight in the darkness as he sat waiting for the nibble with a finger of his other hand inside a loop of the line he had run from the frame of the mosquito net to the chain of the unfrosted light bulb overhead. The line was taut as a banjo string, and the merest tug would snap it on and blind the shivering quarry in a blaze of light. Havemeyer would chortle exultantly as he watched the tiny mammal freeze and roll its terrified eyes about in frantic search of the intruder. Havemeyer would wait until the eyes fell upon his own, and then he laughed aloud and pulled the trigger at the same time, showering the rank, furry body all over the tent with a reverberating crash and dispatching its timid soul back to his or her creator. Late one night, Havemeyer fired a shot at a mouse that brought Hungry Joe bolting out at him barefoot, ranting at the top of his screechy voice and emptying his own 45 into Habermeyer's tent as he came charging down one side of the ditch and up the other, and vanished all at once inside one of the slip trenches that had appeared like magic beside every tent the morning after Milo Minderbinder had bombed the squadron. It was just before dawn, during the great big siege of Bologna, when tongueless dead men peopled the night hours like living ghosts, and Hungry Joe was half out of his mind because he had finished his missions again and was not scheduled to fly. Hungry Joe was babbling incoherently when they fished him out from the dank bottom of the slit trench, babbling of snakes, rats, and spiders. The others flashed their searchlights down just to make sure. There was nothing inside but a few inches of stagnant rainwater. You see, cried Habermeyer. I told you. I told you he was crazy, didn't I? Hungry Joe was crazy, and no one knew it better than Yossarian, who did everything he could to help him. Hungry Joe just wouldn't listen to Yossarian. Hungry Joe just wouldn't listen because he thought Yossarian was crazy. Why should he listen to you? Dr. Nika inquired of Yossarian without looking up. Because he's got troubles? Dr. Nika snorted scornfully. He thinks he's got troubles? What about me? Dr. Nika continued slowly with a gloomy sneer. Oh, I'm not complaining. I know there's a war on. I know a lot of people are going to have to suffer for us to win it. But why must I be one of them? Why don't they draft some of those old doctors who keep shooting their kisses off in public about what big sacrifices the medical game stands ready to make? I don't want to make sacrifices. I want to make dough. Dr. Nika was a very neat, clean man, whose idea of a good time was to sulk. He had a dark complexion and a small, wise, saturnine face with mournful pouches under both eyes. He brooded over his health continually and went almost daily to the medical tent to have his temperature taken by one of the two enlisted men there who ran things for him practically on their own, and ran it so efficiently that he was left with little else to do but sit in the sunlight with a stuffed nose and wonder what other people were so worried about. All men reporting on sick call with temperatures above 102 were rushed to the hospital. All those except Yossarian reporting on sick call with temperatures below 102 had their gums and toes painted with gentian violet solution and were given a laxative to throw away into the bushes. All those reporting on a sick call with temperatures of exactly 102 were asked to return in an hour to have their temperatures taken again. Yossarian, with his temperature of 101, could go to the hospital whenever he wanted to, because he was not afraid of them. Dr. Nika lived in a splotched gray tent with Chief White Halfo, whom he feared and despised. I just can't picture his liver, Dr. Nika grumbled. Picture my liver, Yossarian advised him. There's nothing wrong with your liver. Well, that shows how much you don't know, Yossarian bluffed and told Dr. Nika about the troublesome pain in his liver that had troubled Nurse Duckett and Nurse Kramer and all the doctors in the hospital because it wouldn't become jaundice and wouldn't go away. Dr. Nika wasn't interested. You think you've got troubles? He wanted to know. What about me? Chief White Halfhoed staggered inside the tent just then with a bottle of whiskey cradle in his arm and sitting himself down pugnaciously between the two of them. Dr. Nika rose without a word and moved his chair outside the tent, his back bowed by the compact kit of injustices that was his perpetual burden. He could not bear the company of his roommate. Chief White Halfhoed thought he was crazy. I don't know what's the matter with that guy, he observed reproachfully. He's got no brains, that's what's the matter with him. If he had any brains, he'd grab a shovel and start digging. Right here in the tent, he'd start digging, right under my cot. He'd strike oil in no time. Don't he know how that enlisted man struck oil with a shovel back in the States? Didn't he ever hear what happened to that kid? What was the name of that rotten rat bastard pimp of a snot-nose back in Colorado? Wintergreen. Wintergreen. He's afraid, Yossarian explained. Oh, no, not Wintergreen. Chief White Halfwood shook his head with undisguised admiration. That stinking little punk wise guy son of a bitch ain't afraid of nobody. Dr. Nika's afraid. That's what's the matter with him. What's he afraid of? He's afraid of you, Yossarian said. He's afraid you're going to die of pneumonia. Ha ha, he'd better be afraid, Chief White Halfwood said. A deep, low laugh rumbled through his massive chest. I will, too, the first chance I get. You just wait and see. Chief White Halfwood was a handsome, swarthy Indian from Oklahoma with a heavy, hard-boned face and tousled black hair, a half-blooded Creek from Enid who, for occult reasons of his own, had made up his mind to die of pneumonia. He was a glowering, vengeful, disillusioned Indian who hated foreigners with names like Cathcart, Corn, Black, and Havermeyer, and wished they'd all go back to where their lousy ancestors had come from. You wouldn't believe it, Yossarian, he ruminated, raising his voice deliberately to bait Dr. Nika. But this used to be a pretty good country to live in before they loused it up with their goddamn piety. Chief White Halford was out to revenge himself upon the white man. He could barely read or write and had been assigned to Captain Black as assistant intelligence officer. How could I learn to read or write? Chief White Halford demanded with simulated belligerence, raising his voice again so that Dr. Nika would hear. Every place we pitched our tent, they sank an oil well. Every time they sank a well, they hit oil. And every time they hit oil, they made us pack up our tent and go someplace else. We were human divining rods. Our whole family had a natural affinity for petroleum deposits, and soon every oil company in the world had technicians chasing us around. We were always on the move. It was one hell of a way to bring a child up, I can tell you. I don't think I ever spent more than a week in one place. His earliest memory was of a geologist. Every time another white half-fold was born, he continued, the stock market turned bullish. Soon whole drilling crews were following us around with all their equipment just to get the jump on each other. Companies began to merge just so they could cut down on the number of people they had to assign to us. But the crowd in back of us kept growing. We never got a good night's sleep. When we stopped, they stopped. When we moved, they moved. Chuck wagons, bulldozers, derricks, generators. We were a walking business boom. And we began to receive invitations from some of the best hotels just for the amount of business we would drag into town with us. Some of those invitations were mighty generous, but we couldn't accept any because we were Indians, and all the best hotels that were inviting us wouldn't accept Indians as guests. Racial prejudice is a terrible thing, Yossarian. It really is. It's a terrible thing to treat a decent, loyal Indian like a nigger, kike, wop, or spick. Chief White Halford nodded slowly with conviction. Then, Yossarian, it finally happened. The beginning of the end. They began to follow us around from in front. They would try to guess where we were going to stop next and would begin drilling before we even got there, so we couldn't stop. As soon as we began to unroll our blankets, they would kick us off. Oh, they had confidence in us. They wouldn't even wait to strike oil before they kicked us off. We were so tired, we almost didn't care the day our time ran out. One morning, we found ourselves completely surrounded by oilmen waiting for us to come their way so they could kick us off. Everywhere you looked, there was an oil man on a ridge, waiting there like Indians getting ready to attack. It was the end. We couldn't stay where we were because we'd just been kicked off, and there was no place left for us to go. Only the army saved me. Luckily, the war broke out just in the nick of time, and a draft board picked me right up out of the middle and put me down safely in Lowry Field, Colorado. I was the only survivor. Yossarian knew he was lying, but did not interrupt as Chief White Halford went on to claim that he had never heard from his parents again. That didn't bother him too much, though, for he had only their word for it that they were his parents. And since they had lied to him about so many other things, they could just as well have been lying to him about that, too. He was much better acquainted with the fate of a tribe of first cousins who had wandered away north in a diversionary movement and pushed inadvertently into Canada. When they tried to return, they were stopped at the border by American immigration authorities who would not let them back into the country. They could not come back in because they were red. It was a horrible joke, but Dr. Nika didn't laugh until Yossarian came to him one mission later and pleaded again, without any real expectation of success, to be grounded. Dr. Nika snickered once and was soon immersed in problems of his own, which included Chief White Halford, who had been challenging him all that morning to Indian wrestle, and Yossarian, who decided right then and there to go crazy. You're wasting your time, Dr. Nika was forced to tell him. Can't you ground someone who's crazy? Oh, sure, I have to. There's a rule saying I have to ground anyone who's crazy. Well, then why didn't you ground me? I'm crazy. Ask Clevenger. Clevenger? Where is Clevenger? You find Clevenger and I'll ask him. Then ask any of the others. They'll tell you how crazy I am. They're crazy. Well, then why did you ground them? Why don't they ask me to ground them? Because they're crazy, that's why. Of course they're crazy, Dr. Nika replied. I just told you they're crazy, didn't I? And you can't let crazy people decide whether you're crazy or not, can you? Yossarian looked at him soberly and tried another approach. Is Orr crazy? He sure is, Dr. Nika said. Can you ground him? I sure can, but first he has to ask me to. That's part of the rule. Then why doesn't he ask you to? Because he's crazy, Dr. Nika said. He has to be crazy to keep flying combat missions after all the close calls he's had. Sure, I can ground Orr, but first he has to ask me to. That's all he has to do to be grounded? That's all. Let him ask me. And then you can ground him? Yossarian asked. No, and I can't ground him. You mean there's a catch? Sure, there's a catch, Dr. Nika replied. Catch-22. Anyone who wants to get out of combat duty isn't really crazy. There was only one catch, and that was Catch-22, which specified that a concern for one's own safety in the face of dangers that were real and immediate was the process of a rational mind. Or was crazy and could be grounded. All he had to do was ask. And as soon as he did, he would no longer be crazy and would have to fly more missions. Or would be crazy to fly more missions and sane if he didn't. But if he was sane, he had to fly them. If he flew them, he was crazy and didn't have to. But if he didn't want to, he was sane and had to. Yossarian was moved very deeply by the absolute simplicity of this clause of Catch-22 and let out a respectful whistle. That's some catch, that Catch-22, he observed. It's the best there is, Dr. Nika agreed. Yossarian saw it clearly in all its spinning reasonableness. There was an elliptical precision about its perfect pairs of parts that was graceful and shocking, like good modern art, and at times Yossarian wasn't quite sure that he saw it at all. Hungry Joe did have 50 missions, but they were no help. He had his bags packed and was waiting again to go home. At night, he had eerie, ear-splitting nightmares that kept everyone in the squadron awake but Hoople, the 15-year-old pilot who had lied about his age to get into the Army and lived with his pet cat in the same tent with Hungry Joe. Hoople was a light sleeper but claimed he never heard Hungry Joe scream. Hungry Joe was sick. So what? Dr. Nika snarled resentfully. I had a maid, I tell you. 50 grand a year I was knocking down. He's sick? How does he think I feel? Hungry Joe was too firmly embedded in calamities of his own to care how Dr. Nika felt. There were the noises, for instance. Small ones enraged him, and he hollered himself hoarse at Arfie for the wet, sucking sounds he made puffing on his pipe, at Orr for tinkering, at McWatt for the explosive snap he gave each card he turned over when he dealt at blackjack or poker, at Dobbs for letting his teeth chatter as he went blundering clumsily about, bumping into things. Hungry Joe was a throbbing, ragged mass of motile irritability, a jumpy, emaciated wreck with a fleshless face of dingy skin and bone, and twitching veins squirming subcutaneously in the blackened hollows behind his eyes like severed sections of snake. It was a desolate, cratered face, sooty with care like an abandoned mining town. Hungry Joe ate voraciously, gnawed incessantly at the tips of his fingers, stammered, choked, itched, sweated, salivated, and sprang from spot to spot fanatically with an intricate black camera with which he was always trying to take pictures of naked girls. They never came out. He was always forgetting to put film in the camera, or turn on lights, or remove the cover from the lens opening. It wasn't easy persuading naked girls to pose, but Hungry Joe had the knack. Me big man, he would shout. Me big photographer from Life magazine. Big pictures on heap big cover. See, Hollywood star. Mucho dinero, mucho divorces, multi flick fick all day long. The pictures never came out, and Hungry Joe never got in. The odd thing was that in civilian life, Hungry Joe really had been a photographer for Life magazine. He was a hero now. The biggest hero the Air Force had, Yossarian felt, for he had flown more combat tours of duty than any other hero the Air Force had. He had flown 6 combat tours of duty. Hungry Joe had finished flying his first combat tour of duty when 25 missions were all that were necessary for him to pack his bags and write happy letters home. Hungry Joe had finished flying his first 25 missions during the week of the Salerno beachhead, when Yossarian was laid up in the hospital with a burst of clap he had caught on a low-level mission over a whack in bushes on a supply flight to Marrakesh. Yossarian did his best to catch up with Hungry Joe, and almost did, flying 6 missions in 6 days. Hungry Joe could no longer stand the strain of waiting for shipping orders, and crumbled promptly into ruin every time he finished another tour of duty. Each time he was taken off combat status, he gave a big party for the little circle of friends he had. He broke out the bottles of bourbon he had managed to buy in his 4-day weekly circuits with the courier plane and laughed, sang, shuffled, and shouted in a festival of inebriated ecstasy until he could no longer keep awake and receded peacefully into slumber. As soon as Yossarian, Nately, and Dunbar put him to bed, he began screaming in his sleep. In the morning, he stepped from his tent looking haggard, fearful, and guilt-ridden, an eaten shell of a human building rocking perilously on the brink of collapse. Every time Colonel Cathcart increased the number of missions and returned Hungry Joe to combat duty, the nightmares stopped, and Hungry Joe settled down into a normal state of terror with a smile of relief. Yossarian read Hungry Joe's shrunken face like a headline. It was good when Hungry Joe looked bad, and terrible when Hungry Joe looked good. Hungry Joe's inverted set of responses was a curious phenomena to everybody but Hungry Joe, who denied the whole thing stubbornly. Who dreams? He answered when Yossarian asked him what he dreamt about. Joe, why don't you go see Dr. Nika? Yossarian advised. Why should I go see Dr. Nika? I'm not sick. What about your nightmares? I don't have nightmares, Hungry Joe lied. Colonel Cathcart believed in his men. As he told them frequently in the briefing room, he believed there were at least 10 missions better than any other outfit and felt that any who did not share this confidence he had placed in them could get the hell out. The only way they could get the hell out, though, as Yossarian learned when he flew to visit XPFC Wintergreen, was by flying the extra 10 missions. I still don't get it, Yossarian protested. Is Dr. Nika right or isn't he? How many did he say? 40. Dr. Nika was telling the truth, XPFC Wintergreen admitted. 40 missions is all you have to fly as far as 27th Air Force Headquarters is concerned. Yossarian was jubilant. Then I can go home, right? I've got 48. No, you can't go home, XPFC Wintergreen corrected him. Are you crazy or something? Why not? Catch-22. Catch-22? Yossarian was stunned. What the hell has Catch-22 got to do with it? Catch-22, Dr. Nika answered patiently, when Hungry Joe had flown Yossarian back to Pianosa, says you've always got to do what your commanding officer tells you to. But 27th Air Force says I can go home with 40 missions. But they don't say you have to go home. And regulations do say you have to obey every order. That's the catch. Even if the colonel were disobeying a 27th Air Force order by making you fly more missions, you'd still have to fly them, or you would be guilty of disobeying an order of his. And then 27th Air Force Headquarters would really jump on you. Yossarian slumped with disappointment. Then I really have to fly the 50 missions, don't I? He grieved. The 55, Dr. Nika corrected him. What 55? The 55 missions the colonel now wants all of you to fly. Hungry Joe heaved a huge sigh of relief when he heard Dr. Nika and broke into a grin. Yossarian grabbed Hungry Joe by the neck and made him fly them both right back to XPFC Wintergreen. What would they do to me, he asked in confidential tones, if I refused to fly them? Oh, we'd probably shoot you, XPFC Wintergreen replied. We? Yossarian cried in surprise. What do you mean we? Since when are you on their side? Well, if you're going to be shot, whose side do you expect me to be on? XPFC Wintergreen retorted. Yossarian winced. Colonel Cathcart had raised him again. Clevenger was dead. That was the basic flaw in his philosophy. 18 planes had let down through a beaming white cloud off the coast of Elba one afternoon on the way back from the weekly milk run to Parma. 17 came out. No trace was ever found of the other, not in the air or on the smooth surface of the jade waters below. There was no debris. Helicopters circled the white cloud till sunset. During the night, the cloud blew away, and in the morning, there was no more Clevenger. The disappearance was astounding. As astounding, certainly, as the grand conspiracy of Lowry Field, when all 64 men in a single barrack vanished one payday and were never heard of again. Until Clevenger was snatched from existence so adroitly, Yossarian had assumed that the men had simply decided unanimously to go AWOL on the same day. In fact, he'd been so encouraged by what appeared to be a mass desertion from sacred responsibility that he had gone running outside in elation to carry the exciting news to XPFC Wintergreen. What's so exciting about it? XPFC Wintergreen sneered obnoxiously, resting his filthy GI shoe on his spade and lounging back in a surly slough against the wall of one of the deep square holes it was his military specialty to dig. XPFC Wintergreen was a snide little punk who enjoyed working at cross purposes. Each time he went AWOL, he was caught and sentenced to dig and fill up holes 6 feet deep, wide, and long for a specified length of time. Each time he finished his sentence, he went AWOL again. XPFC Wintergreen accepted his role of digging and filling up holes with all of the uncomplaining dedication of a true patriot. It's not a bad life, he would observe philosophically. I guess somebody has to do it. He had wisdom enough to understand that digging holes in Colorado was not such a bad assignment in wartime. Since the holes were in no great demand, he could dig them and fill them up at a leisurely pace, and he was seldom overworked. On the other hand, he was busted down to buck private every time he was court-martialed, and he regretted this loss of rank keenly. It was kind of nice being a PFC, he reminisced yearningly. I had status, you know what I mean? And I used to travel in the best circles. His face darkened with resignation. But that's all behind me now, he guessed. The next time I go over the hill will be just as a buck private, and I just know it won't be the same. There was no future in digging holes. The job isn't even steady. I lose it each time I finish serving my sentence. Then I have to go over the hill again if I want it back. And I can't even keep doing that. There's a catch. Catch-22. The next time I go over the hill, it will mean the stockade. I don't know what's going to become of me. I might even wind up overseas if I'm not careful. He did not want to keep digging holes for the rest of his life, although he had no objection to doing it as long as there was a war going on and it was part of the war effort. It's a matter of duty, he observed, and we each have our own to perform. My duty is to keep digging these holes, and I've been doing such a good job of it that I've just been recommended for the Good Conduct Medal. Your duty is to screw around at cadet school and hope the war ends before you get out. The duty of the men in combat is to win the war, and I just wish they were doing their duty as well as I've been doing mine. It wouldn't be fair if I had to go overseas and do their job too, would it? There was no escaping the mission to Bologna. Once Colonel Cathcart had volunteered his group for the ammunition dumps there that the heavy bombers on the Italian mainland had been unable to destroy from their higher altitudes. Each day's delay deepened the awareness and deepened the gloom. The clinging, overpowering conviction of death spread steadily with a continuing rainfall, soaking mordantly into each man's ailing countenance, like the corrosive blot of some crawling disease. Everyone smelled of formaldehyde. There was nowhere to turn for help, not even to the medical tent, which had been ordered closed by Colonel Corn, so that no one could report for sick call, as the men had done on the one clear day with a mysterious epidemic of diarrhea that had forced still another postponement. The fear flowed everywhere, into Dunbar's squadron, where Dunbar poked his head inquiringly through the entrance of the medical tent there one twilight, and spoke respectfully to the blurred outline of Dr. Stubbs, who was sitting in the dense shadows inside, before a bottle of whiskey and a bell jar filled with purified drinking water. Are you all right? He asked solicitously. Terrible, Dr. Stubbs answered. What are you doing here? Sitting? I thought there was no more sick call. All right. Then why are you sitting here? Where else should I sit? At the goddamn officers' club with Colonel Cathcart and Corn? You know what I'm doing here? Sitting. No, in the squadron, I mean, not in the tent. Don't be such a goddamn wise guy. Can you figure out what a doctor's doing here in the squadron? Well, they've got the doors to the medical tents nailed shut in the other squadrons, Dunbar remarked. If anyone sick walks through my door, I'm going to ground him, Dr. Stubbs vowed. I don't give a damn what they say. You can't ground anyone, Dunbar reminded. Don't you know the orders? I'll knock him flat on his ass with an injection and really ground him. Dr. Stubbs laughed with sardonic amusement at the prospect. They think they can order sick call out of existence, the bastards. Whoops, there it goes again. The rain began falling again, first in the trees, then in the mud puddles, then faintly like a soothing murmur on the tent top. Everything's wet, Dr. Stubbs observed with revulsion. Even the latrines and urinals are backing up in protest. The whole goddamn world smells like a charnel house. The silence seemed bottomless when he stopped talking. Night fell. There was a sense of vast isolation. Turn on the light, Dunbar suggested. There is no light. I don't feel like starting my generator. You know, I used to get a big kick out of saving people's lives. Now I wonder what the hell's the point since they all have to die anyway. Oh, there's a point, all right, Dunbar assured her. Is there? What's the point? Well, the point is to keep him from dying for as long as you can. Yeah, well, what's the point since they all have to die anyway? Well, the trick is not to think about that. Never mind the trick. What the hell's the point? Dunbar pondered in silence for a few moments. Well, Dunbar didn't know. Bologna should have exalted Dunbar, because the minutes dawdled and the hours dragged like centuries. Instead, it tortured him because he knew he was going to be killed. You really want some more codeine? Dr. Stubbs asked. Yeah, it's for my friend Yossarian. He's sure he's going to be killed. Yossarian? Who the hell is Yossarian? What the hell kind of a name is Yossarian anyway? Isn't he the one who got drunk and started that fight with Colonel Corn at the officers' club the other night? Yeah, that's right. He's a Syrian. That crazy bastard. Well, he's not so crazy, Dunbar said. He swears he's not going to fly to Bologna. Well, that's just what I mean, Dr. Stubbs answered. That crazy bastard may be the only sane one left. It was Sergeant Knight who triggered the solemn panic at Bologna, slipping silently off the truck for 2 extra flak suits as soon as he learned the target, and signaling the start of the grim procession back into the parachute tent that degenerated into a frantic stampede finally before all the extra flak suits were gone. Hey, what's going on? Kid Sampson asked nervously. Bologna can't be that rough, can it? Nadley, sitting trance-like on the floor of the truck, held his grave young face in both hands and did not answer. It was Sergeant Knight and the cruel series of postponements, for just as they were climbing up into their planes that first morning, along came a jeep with the news that it was raining in Bologna and that the mission would be delayed. It was raining in Pianosa, too, by the time they returned to the squadron, and they had the rest of that day to stare woodenly at the bomb line on the map under the awning of the intelligence tent and ruminate hypnotically on the fact that there was no escape. The evidence was there vividly in the narrow red ribbon tacked across the mainland. The ground forces in Italy were pinned down 42 insurmountable miles south of the target and could not possibly capture the city in time. Nothing could save the men in Pianosa from the mission to Bologna. They were trapped. Their only hope was that it would never stop raining, and they had no hope because they all knew it would. When it did stop raining in Pianosa, it rained in Bologna. When it stopped raining in Bologna, it began again in Pianosa. If there was no rain at all, there were freakish, inexplicable phenomena, like the epidemic of diarrhea or the bomb line that moved. 4 times during the first 6 days, they were assembled and briefed and then sent back. Once they took off and were flying in formation when the control tower summoned them down. The more it rained, the worse they suffered. The worse they suffered, the more they prayed that it would continue raining. All through the night, men looked at the sky and were saddened by the stars. All through the day, they looked at the bomb line on the big wobbling easel map of Italy that blew over in the wind and was dragged in under the awning of the intelligence tent every time the rain began. The bomb line was a scarlet band of narrow satin ribbon that delineated the forwardmost position of the Allied ground forces in every sector of the Italian mainland. The morning after Hungry Joe's first fight with Hoople's cat, the rain stopped falling in both places. The landing strip began to dry. It would take a full 24 hours to harden, but the sky remained cloudless. The resentments incubating in each man hatched into hatred. First, they hated the infantrymen on the mainland because they had failed to capture Bologna. Then they began to hate the bomb line itself. For hours, they stared relentlessly at the scarlet ribbon on the map and hated it because it would not move up high enough to encompass the city. When night fell, they congregated in the darkness with flashlights, continuing their macabre vigil at the bomb line and brooding entreaty, as though hoping to move the ribbon up by the collective weight of their sullen prayers. I really can't believe it, Clevenger exclaimed to Yossarian in a voice rising and falling in protest and wonder. It's a complete reversion to primitive superstition. They're confusing cause and effect. It makes as much sense as knocking on wood or crossing your fingers. They really believe that we wouldn't have to fly that mission tomorrow if someone would only tiptoe up to the map in the middle of the night and move the bomb line over Bologna. Can't you imagine? You and I must be the only rational ones left. In the middle of the night, Yossarian knocked on wood, crossed his fingers, and tiptoed out of his tent to move the bomb line up over Bologna. Corporal Kaladny tiptoed stealthily into Captain Black's tent early the next morning, reached inside the mosquito net, and gently shook the moist shoulder blade he found there until Captain Black opened his eyes. "What are you waking me up for?" whimpered Captain Black. "They captured Bologna, sir," said Corporal Kaladny. "I thought you'd want to know. Is the mission canceled?" Captain Black tugged himself erect and began scratching his scrawny, long thighs methodically. In a little while he dressed and emerged from his tent, squinting, cross, and unshaven. The sky was clear and warm. He peered without emotion at the map. Sure enough, they had captured Bologna. Inside the intelligence tent, Corporal Kaladny was already removing the maps of Bologna from the navigation kits. Captain Black seated himself with a loud yawn, lifted his feet to the top of his desk, and phoned Colonel Korn. "What are you waking me up for?" whimpered Colonel Korn. "They captured Bologna during the night, sir. Is the mission canceled?" "What are you talking about, Black?" Colonel Korn growled. "Why should the mission be canceled?" "Well, because they captured Bologna, sir. Isn't the mission canceled?" Of course the mission is canceled. Do you think we're bombing our own troops now? What are you waking me up for? Colonel Cathcart whimpered to Colonel Corn. They captured Bologna, Colonel Corn told him. I thought you'd want to know. Who captured Bologna? We did. Colonel Cathcart was overjoyed, for he was relieved of the embarrassing commitment to bomb Bologna without blemish to the reputation for valor he had earned by volunteering his men to do it. Clevenger agreed with ex-PFC Wintergreen that it was Yossarian's job to get killed over Bologna, and he was livid with condemnation when Yossarian confessed that it was he who had moved the bomb line and caused the mission to be canceled. Why the hell not? Yossarian snarled, arguing all the more vehemently because he suspected he was wrong. Am I supposed to get my ass shut off just because the colonel wants to be a general? Well, what about the men on the mainland? Clevenger demanded with just as much emotion. Are they supposed to get their asses shot off just because you don't want to go? These men are entitled to air support. Yeah, but not necessarily by me. Look, they don't care who knocks out those ammunition dumps. The only reason we're going is because that bastard Cathcart volunteered us. Oh, I know all that, Clevenger assured him, his gaunt face pale and his agitated brown eyes swimming in sincerity. But the fact remains that those ammunition dumps are still standing. You know very well that I don't approve of Colonel Cathcart any more than you do. Clevenger paused for emphasis, his mouth quivering, and then beat his fist down softly against his sleeping bag. But it's not for us to determine what targets must be destroyed or who's to destroy them or who gets killed doing it and why. Yes, even that. We have no right to question. You're insane. No right to question. Do you really mean that it's not my business how or why I get killed and that it is Colonel Cathcart's? Do you really mean that? Yes, I do, Clevenger insisted, seeming unsure. There are men entrusted with winning the war who are in a much better position than we are to decide what targets have to be bombed. We are talking about two different things, Yossarian answered with exaggerated weariness. You are talking about the relationship of the Air Corps to the infantry, and I am talking about the relationship of me to Colonel Cathcart. You are talking about winning the war, and I am talking about winning the war and keeping alive. Exactly, Clevenger snapped smugly. And which do you think is more important? To whom? Yossarian shot back. Open your eyes, Clevenger. It doesn't make a damn bit of difference who wins the war to someone who's dead. Clevenger sat for a moment as though he'd been slapped. Congratulations, he exclaimed bitterly, the thinnest milk-white line enclosing his lips tightly in a bloodless squeezing ring. I can't think of another attitude that could be depended upon to give greater comfort to the enemy. The enemy, retorted Yossarian with weighted precision, is anybody who's going to get you killed no matter which side he's on, and that includes Colonel Cathcart. And don't you forget that, because the longer you remember it, the longer you might live. But Clevenger did forget it, and now he was dead. By the time of the mission to Bologna, Yossarian was brave enough not to go around over the target even once. And when he found himself aloft, finally, in the nose of Kid Sampson's plane, he pressed in the button of his throat mic and asked, Well, what's wrong with the plane? Kid Sampson let out a shriek. Is something wrong with the plane? What's the matter? Kid Sampson's cry turned Yossarian to ice. Is something the matter? He yelled in horror. Are we bailing out? I don't know, Kid Sampson shot back in anguish, wailing excitedly. Someone said we're bailing out. Who is this, anyway? Who is this? This is Yossarian in the nose. Yossarian in the nose. I heard you say there was something the matter. Didn't you say there was something the matter? No, I thought you said there was something wrong. Everything seems okay. Everything's all right. Yossarian's heart sank. Something was terribly wrong if everything was all right and they had no excuse for turning back. He hesitated gravely. I can't hear you, he said. I said everything is all right. The sun was blinding white on the porcelain blue water below and on the flashing edges of the other airplanes. Yossarian took hold of the colored wires leading into the jackbox of the intercom system and tore them loose. I still can't hear you, he said. He heard nothing. Slowly, he collected his map case and his 3 flak suits and crawled back to the main compartment. Nadley, sitting stiffly in the co-pilot seat, spied him through the corner of his eye as he stepped up to the flight deck behind Kid Sampson. He smiled at Yossarian wanly, looking frail and exceptionally young and bashful in the bulky dungeon of his earphones, hat, throat mic, flak suit, and parachute. Yossarian bent close to Kid Sampson's ear. I still can't hear you, he shouted above the even drone of the engines. Kid Sampson glanced back at him with surprise. Kid Sampson had an angular, comical face with arched eyebrows and a scrawny blonde mustache. What? He called out over his shoulder. I still can't hear you. Yossarian repeated. You'll have to talk louder, Kid Sampson said. I still can't hear you. I said I still can't hear you, Yossarian yelled. I can't help it, Kid Sampson yelled back at him. I'm shouting as loud as I can. I couldn't hear you over my intercom, Yossarian bellowed in mounting helplessness. You'll have to turn back. For an intercom? Asked Kid Sampson incredulously. Turn back, said Yossarian, before I break your hat. Kid Sampson looked for moral support toward Nately, who stared away from him pointedly. Yossarian outranked them both. Kid Sampson resisted doubtfully for another moment and then capitulated eagerly with a triumphant whoop. Well, that's just fine with me, he announced gladly, and blew out a shrill series of whistles up into his mustache. Yes, sirree, that's just fine with Kid Sampson. He whistled again and shouted over the intercom. Now hear this, my little chickadees. This is Admiral Kid Sampson talking. This is Admiral Kid Sampson squawking, the pride of the Queen's Marines. Yes, sirree. We're turning back, boys. By cracking, we're turning back. Nately ripped off his hat and earphones in one jubilant sweep and began rocking back and forth happily, like a handsome child in a high chair. Sergeant Knight came plummeting down from the top gun turret and began pounding them all on the back with delirious enthusiasm. Kid Sampson turned the plane away from the formation in a wide, graceful arc and headed toward the airfield. Back at the field, the party fizzled out abruptly. An uneasy silence replaced it, and Yossarian was sober and self-conscious as he climbed down from the plane and took his place in the jeep that was already waiting for them. None of the men spoke at all on the drive back through the heavy, mesmerizing, quiet, blanketing mountains, sea, and forests. The feeling of desolation persisted when they turned off the road at the squadron. Yossarian got out of the car last. The jeep started up again softly. Kid Sampson, Nately, and the others wandered apart in a noiseless eddy of motion and were sucked away into the cloying yellow stillness. The jeep vanished with a cough. Yossarian was alone in a ponderous primeval lull in which everything green looked black and everything else was imbued with the color of pus. The breeze rustled leaves in a dry and diaphanous distance. He was restless, scared, and sleepy. The sockets of his eyes felt grimy with exhaustion. Wearily he moved inside the parachute tent with its long table of smoothed wood, a nagging bitch of a doubt burrowing painlessly inside a consciousness that felt perfectly clear. He left his flak suit and parachute there and crossed back past the water wagon to the intelligence tent to return his map case to Captain Black, who sat drowsing in his chair with his skinny long legs up on his desk, and inquired with indifferent curiosity why Yossarian's plane had turned back. Yossarian ignored him. He set the map down on the counter and walked out. Back in his own tent, he squirmed out of his parachute harness and then out of his clothes. Orr was in Rome, due back that same afternoon from the rest leave he had won by ditching his plane in the waters of Genoa. Nately would already be packing to replace him, entranced to find himself still alive and undoubtedly impatient to resume his wasted and heartbreaking courtship of his prostitute in Rome. When Yossarian was undressed, he sat down on his cot to rest. He felt much better as soon as he was naked. He never felt so comfortable in clothes. In a little while, he put fresh undershorts back on and set out for the beach in his moccasins, a khaki-colored bath towel draped over his shoulders. The beach was deserted. The only sounds were hushed ones, the bloated gurgle of the stream, the respirating hum of the tall grass and shrubs behind him, the apathetic moaning of the dumb, translucent waves. The surf was always small, the water clear and cool. Yossarian left his things on the sand and moved through the knee-high waves until he was completely immersed. On the other side of the sea, a bumpy sliver of dark land lay wrapped in mist, almost invisible. He swam languorously out to the raft, held on a moment, and swam languorously back to where he could stand on the sandbar. He submerged himself head first into the green water several times until he felt clean and wide awake, and then stretched himself out face down in the sand and slept until the planes returning from Bologna were almost overhead, and the great, cumulative rumble of their many engines came crashing in through his slumber in an earth-shattering roar. He woke up blinking with a slight pain in his head, and opened his eyes upon a world boiling in chaos, in which everything was in proper order. He gasped in utter amazement at the fantastic sight of the 12 flights of planes organized calmly into exact formation. The scene was too unexpected to be true. There were no planes spurting ahead with wounded, none lagging behind with damage. No distress flares smoked in the sky. No ship was missing but his own. For an instant he was paralyzed with a sensation of madness. Then he understood and almost wept at the irony. The explanation was simple. Clouds had covered the target before the planes could bomb it, and the mission to Bologna was still to be flown. He was wrong. There had been no clouds. Bologna had been bombed. Bologna was a milk run. There had been no flag there at all. Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren, the inoffensive Joint Squadron Operations officers, were both mild, soft-spoken men. They were shifty, cheerful, subservient men who were comfortable only with each other and never met anyone else's eyes, not even Yossarian's at the open-air meeting they called to reprimand him publicly for making Kid Sampson turn back from the mission to Bologna. "Fellas," said Captain Pilchard, who had thinning dark hair and smiled awkwardly, "when you turn back from a mission, try to make sure it's for something important, will you? Not for something unimportant, like a defective intercom or something like that, okay? Captain Wren has more he wants to say to you on that subject." "Captain Pilchard's right, fellas," said Captain Wren, "and that's all I'm going to say to you on that subject. Well, we finally got to Bologna today, and we found out it's a milk run. We were a little nervous, I guess, and didn't do too much damage. Well, listen to this. Colonel Cathcart got permission for us to go back, and tomorrow we're really going to pace those ammunition dumps. Now, what do you think about that?" And to prove to Yossarian that they bore him no animosity, they even assigned him to fly lead bombardier with McWatt in the first formation when they went back to Bologna the next day. He came in on the target like a Havemeyer, confidently taking no evasive action at all, and suddenly they were shooting the living shit out of him. Heavy flak was everywhere. He'd been lulled, lured, and trapped, and there was nothing he could do but sit there like an idiot and watch the ugly black puffs smashing up to kill him. There was nothing he could do until his bombs dropped but look back into the bomb site, where the fine crosshairs and the lens were glued magnetically over the target exactly where he had placed them. He was trembling steadily as the plane crept ahead. He could hear the hollow boom, 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 boom of the flak pounding all around him in overlapping measures of 4, the sharp, piercing crack of a single shell exploding suddenly very close by. His head was bursting with 1,000 dissonant impulses as he prayed for the bombs to drop. He wanted to sob. The engines droned on monotonously like a fat, lazy fly. At last, the indices on the bomb site crossed, tripping away the 8 500-pounders one after the other. The plane lurched upward buoyantly with a lightened load. Yossarian bent away from the bomb site crookedly to watch the indicator on his left. When the pointer touched 0, he closed the bomb bay doors and over the intercom, at the very top of his voice, shrieked, "Turn right, hard!" McWatt responded instantly. With a grinding howl of engines, he flipped the plane over on one wing and wrung it around remorselessly in a screaming turn away from the twin spires of flak Yossarian had spied, stabbing towards them. Then Yossarian had McWatt climb and keep climbing higher and higher until they tore free finally into a calm, diamond blue sky that was sunny and pure everywhere, and laced in the distance with long white veils of tenuous fluff. The wind strummed soothingly against the cylindrical panes of his windows, and he relaxed exultantly, only until they picked up speed again, and then turned McWatt left and plunged him right back down, noticing with a transitory spasm of elation the mushrooming clusters of flak leaping open high above him and back over his shoulder to the right, exactly where he could have been if he had not turned left and dived. He leveled McWatt out with another harsh cry, and whipped him upward and around again into a ragged blue patch of unpolluted air, just as the bombs he had dropped began to strike. The first one fell in the yard, exactly where he had aimed, and then the rest of the bombs from his own plane and from the other planes in his flight burst open upon the ground in a charge of rapid orange flashes across the tops of the buildings, which collapsed instantly into a vast, churning wave of pink and gray and coal-black smoke that went rolling out turbulently in all directions and quaked convulsively in its bowels as though from great blasts of red and white and golden sheet lightning. "Wow, will you look at that?" Arfie marveled sonorously, right behind Yossarian, his plump, orbicular face sparkling with a look of bright enchantment. "There must have been an ammunition dump down there." Yossarian had forgotten about Arfie. "Get out!" he shouted at him. "Get out of the nose!" Arfie smiled politely and pointed down toward the target in a generous invitation for Yossarian to look. Yossarian began slapping at him insistently and signaled wildly towards the entrance of the crawlway. Get back in the ship, he cried frantically. Get back in the ship! Arfi shrugged amiably. I can't hear you, he explained. Yossarian seized him by the straps of his parachute harness and pushed him backward toward the crawlway just as the plane was hit with a jarring concussion that rattled his bones and made his heart stop. He knew at once they were all dead. Climb! He screamed into the intercom at McWatt when he saw he was still alive. Climb, you bastard! Climb, 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 climb! The plane zoomed upward again in a climb that was swift and straining until he leveled it out with another harsh shot at McWatt and wrenched it around once more in a roaring, merciless 45-degree turn that sucked his insides out in one enervating sniff and left him floating fleshlessly in midair until he leveled McWatt out again just long enough to hurl him back around towards the right and then down into a screeching dive. Through endless blobs of ghostly black smoke he sped, the hanging smut wafting against the smooth plexiglass nose of the ship like an evil, damp, sooty vapor against his cheeks. His heart was hammering again in aching terror as he hurled upward and downward through the blinding gangs of flak, charging murderously into the sky at him, then sagging inertly. Sweat gushed from his neck in torrents and poured down over his chest and waist with a feeling of warm slime. He was vaguely aware for an instant that the planes in his formation were no longer there, and then he was aware of only himself. His throat hurt like a raw slash from the strangling intensity with which he shrieked each command to McWatt. The engines rose to a deafening, agonized, undulating bellow each time McWatt changed directions. And far out in front, the bursts of flak were still swarming into the sky from new batteries of guns poking around for accurate altitude as they waited sadistically for him to fly into range. The plane was slammed again, suddenly with another loud, jarring explosion that almost rocked it over on its back. And the nose filled immediately with sweet clouds of blue smoke. Something was on fire. Yossarian whirled to escape and smacked into Arfi, who had struck a match and was placidly lighting his pipe. Yossarian gaped at his grinning moon-faced navigator in utter shock and confusion. It occurred to him that one of them was mad. Jesus Christ, he screamed at Arfi in tortured amazement. Get the hell out of the nose! Are you crazy? Get out! What? Said Arfi. Get out! Yossarian yelled hysterically and began clubbing Arfi backhanded with both fists to drive him away. Get out! I still can't hear you, Arfi called back innocently with an expression of mild and reproving perplexity. You'll have to talk a little louder. Get out of the nose, Yossarian shrieked in frustration. They're trying to kill us, don't you understand? They're trying to kill us! Which way shall I go, goddammit? McWatt shouted furiously over the intercom in a suffering, high-pitched voice. Which way shall I go? Turn left! Left, you goddamn dirty son of a bitch! Turn left, hard! Arfi crept up close behind Yossarian and jabbed him sharply in the ribs with the stem of his pipe. Yossarian flew up toward the ceiling with a whinnying cry, then jumped completely around on his knees, white as a sheet and quivering with rage. Arfi winked encouragingly and jerked his thumb back toward McWatt with a humorous whooey. What's eating him? He asked with a laugh. Yossarian was struck with a weird sense of distortion. Will you get out of here? He yelped beseechingly and shoved Arfi over with all his strength. Are you deaf or something? Get back in the plane! And to McWatt he screamed, Dive! Dive! Down they sank once more into the crunching, thudding, voluminous barrage of bursting anti-aircraft shells as Arfi came creeping back behind Yossarian and jabbed him sharply into the ribs again. Yossarian shied upward with another whinnying gasp. I still couldn't hear you, Arfi said. I said, get out of here, Yossarian shouted and broke into tears. He began punching Arfi in the body with both hands as hard as he could. Get away from me! Get away! Punching Arfi was like sinking his fists into a limp sack of inflated rubber. There was no resistance, no response at all from the soft, insensitive mass. And after a while, Yossarian's spirit died and his arms dropped helplessly with exhaustion. He was overcome with a humiliating feeling of impotence and was ready to weep in self-pity. What did you say? Arfi asked. Get away from me, Yossarian answered, pleading with him now. Get back into the plane. Still can't hear you. Never mind, wailed Yossarian. Never mind, just leave me alone. Never mind what? Yossarian began hitting himself in the forehead. He seized Arfi by the shirt front and, struggling to his feet for traction, dragged him to the rear of the nose compartment and flung him down like a bloated and unwieldy bag in the entrance of the crawlway. A shell banged open with a stupendous clop right beside his ear, and he was scrambling back towards the front. In some undestroyed recess of his intelligence wondered that it did not kill them all. They were climbing again. The engines were howling again as though in pain, and the air inside the plane was acrid with the smell of machinery and fetid with the stench of gasoline. The next thing he knew, it was snowing. Thousands of tiny bits of white paper were falling like snowflakes inside the plane, milling around his head so thickly that they clung to his eyelashes when he blinked in astonishment and fluttered against his nostrils and lips each time he inhaled. When he spun around in bewilderment, Arfie was grinning proudly from ear to ear like something inhuman as he held up a shattered paper map for Yossarian to see. A large chunk of flak had ripped up from the floor through Arfie's colossal jumble of maps and had ripped out through the ceiling inches away from their heads. Arfie's joy was sublime. Will you look at this? He murmured, waggling two of his stubby fingers playfully into Yossarian's face through the hole in one of his maps. Will you look at this? Yossarian was dumbfounded by his state of rapturous contentment. Arfie was like an eerie ogre in a dream, incapable of being bruised or evaded, and Yossarian dreaded him for a complex of reasons he was too petrified to untangle. Wind whistling up through the jagged gash in the floor kept the myriad bits of paper circulating like alabaster particles in a paperweight and contributed to a sensation of lacquered, waterlogged unreality. Everything seemed strange, so tawdry and grotesque. His head was throbbing from a shrill clamor that drilled relentlessly into both ears. It was McWatt begging for directions in an incoherent frenzy. Yossarian continued staring in tormented fascination at Arfie's spherical countenance beaming at him so serenely and vacantly through the drifting whorls of white paper bits, and concluded that he was a raving lunatic, just as 8 bursts of flak broke open successively at eye level off to the right, then 8 more, and then 8 more. The last group pulled over towards the left so that they were almost directly in front. Turn left hard, he hollered to McWatt as Arfie kept grinning. And McWatt did turn left hard, but the flak turned left hard with him, catching up fast. And Yossarian hollered, I said hard, 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 you bastard, hard! And McWatt bent the plane around even harder still. And suddenly, miraculously, they were out of range. The flak ended. The gun stopped booming at them, and they were alive. Behind him, men were dying. Strung out for miles in a stricken, tortuous, squirming line, the other flights of planes were making the same hazardous journey over the target, threading their swift way through the swollen masses of new and old bursts of flak, like rats racing in a pack through their own droppings. One was on fire and flapped lamely off by itself, billowing gigantically like a monstrous blood-red star. As Yossarian watched, the burning plane floated over on its side and began spiraling down slowly, in wide, tremulous, narrowing circles, its huge flaming burden blazing orange and flaring out and back like a long, swirling cape of fire and smoke. There were parachutes. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the plane gyrated into a full spin and fell the rest of the way to the ground, fluttering insensibly inside its vivid pyre like a shred of colored tissue paper. One whole flight of planes from another squadron had been blasted apart. Yossarian sighed barrenly, his day's work done. He was listless and sticky. The engines crooned mellifluously as McWatt throttled back to loiter and allow the rest of the planes in his flight to catch up. The abrupt stillness seemed alien and artificial, a little insidious. Yossarian unsnapped his flak suit and took off his helmet. He sighed again, restlessly, and closed his eyes and tried to relax. Where's Orr? Someone asked suddenly over his intercom. Yossarian bounded up with a one-syllable cry that crackled with anxiety and provided the only rational explanation for the whole mysterious phenomenon of the flak at Bologna. Orr! He lunged forward over the bomb site to search downward through the plexiglass for some reassuring sign of Orr, who drew flak like a magnet and who had undoubtedly attracted the cracked batteries of the whole Hermann Goering division to Bologna overnight from wherever the hell they had been stationed the day before when Orr was still in Rome. Arfie launched himself forward an instant later and cracked Yossarian on the bridge of the nose with the sharp rim of his flak helmet. Yossarian cursed him as his eyes flooded with tears. There he is, Arfie orated funereally, pointing down dramatically at a hay wagon and 2 horses standing before the barn of the gray stone farmhouse. Smashed to bits. I guess their numbers were all up. Yossarian swore at Arfie again and continued searching intently, cold with a compassionate kind of fear now for the little bouncy and bizarre buck-toothed tent mate who had smashed Appleby's forehead open with a ping-pong racket. and who was scaring the daylights out of Yossarian once again. At last, Yossarian spotted the two-engine, twin-ruddered plane as it flew out of the green background of the forests over a field of yellow farmland. One of the propellers was feathered and perfectly still, but the plane was maintaining altitude and holding a proper course. Yossarian muttered an unconscious prayer of thankfulness and then flared up at Orr savagely in a ranting fusion of resentment and relief. "That bastard," he began. "That goddamn stunted, red-faced, big-cheeked, curly-headed, buck-toothed, rat bastard son of a bitch." "What?" said Orphy. "That dirty, goddamn, midget-ass, apple-cheeked, goggle-eyed, undersized, buck-toothed, grinning, crazy son of a bitchin' bastard," Yossarian sputtered. "What? Never mind. I still can't hear you," Arthur answered. Yossarian swung himself around methodically to face Arthur. "You prick," he began. "Me? You pompous, rotund, neighborly vacuous complacent." Arthur was unperturbed. Calmly, he struck a wooden match and sucked noisily at his pipe with an eloquent air of benign and magnanimous forgiveness. He smiled sociably and opened his mouth to speak. Yossarian put his hand over Arfie's mouth and pushed him away wearily. He shut his eyes and pretended to sleep all the way back to the field so that he would not have to listen to Arfie or see him. At the briefing room, Yossarian made his intelligence report to Captain Black, and then waited in muttering suspense with all the others until Orr chugged into sight overhead, finally, with his one good engine still keeping him aloft gamely. Nobody breathed. Orr's landing gear would not come down. Yossarian hung around only until Orr had crash landed safely, and then stole the first jeep he could find with a key in the ignition and raced back to his tent to begin packing feverishly for the emergency rest leave he had decided to take in Rome, where he found Luciana and her invisible scar that same night. She told him some lies about a single weekend in bed with a slaughtered fiancé in the Italian army, and they all turned out to be true, for she cried, "Finito," almost as soon as he started, and wondered why he didn't stop until he had finito too, and explained to her. He lit cigarettes for both of them. She was enchanted by the deep suntan covering his whole body. He wondered about the pink chemise that she would not remove. It was cut like a man's undershirt with narrow shoulder straps, and concealed the invisible scar on her back that she refused to let him see after he had made her tell him it was there. She grew tense as fine steel when he traced the mutilated contours with his fingertip from a pit in her shoulder blade almost to the base of her spine. He winced at the many tortured nights she had spent in the hospital, drugged or in pain, with the ubiquitous, eradicable odors of ether, fecal matter, and disinfectant, of human flesh mortified and decaying amid the white uniforms, the rubber-soled shoes, and the eerie night lights glowing dimly until dawn in the corridors. She had been wounded in an air raid. "Dove?" he asked, and he held his breath in suspense. "Napoli." "Germans?" "Americani." His heart cracked, and he fell in love. He wondered if she would marry him. "Tu sei pazzo," she told him with a pleasant laugh. "Why am I crazy?" he asked. "Perché non posso sposare?" "Why can't you get married?" "Because I am not a virgin," she answered. "What has that got to do with it?" "Who will marry me? No one wants a girl who is not a virgin." "I will. I'll marry you." "Ma non posso sposarti." "Why can't you marry me?" "Perché sei pazzo." "Why am I crazy?" "Perché vuoi sposarmi?" Yossarian wrinkled his forehead with quizzical amusement. "You won't marry me because I'm crazy, and you say I'm crazy because I want to marry you? Is that right?" "Si." "Tu sei pazzo," he told her loudly. "Perché?" she shouted back at him indignantly, her unavoidable round breasts rising and falling in a saucy huff beneath the pink chemise as she sat up in bed indignantly. "Why am I crazy?" "Because you won't marry me." "Stupido!" she shouted back at him and smacked him loudly and flamboyantly on the chest with the back of her hand. "Non posso sposarti. Non capisco. Non posso sposarti." "Oh, sure, I understand. And why can't you marry me?" "Perché sei pazzo." "And why am I crazy?" "Perché vuoi sposarmi?" "Because I want to marry you." "Carina, te amo," he explained, and he drew her gently back down to the pillow. "Ti amo molto." "Tu sei pazzo," she murmured in reply, flattered. "Perché?" "Because you say you love me." "How can you love a girl who is not a virgin?" "Because I can't marry you." She bolted right up again in a threatening rage. "Why can't you marry me?" she demanded, ready to cloud him again if he gave an uncomplimentary reply. "Just because I am not a virgin?" "No, no, darling, because you're crazy." He stuffed money into her hand when they were finished. She hugged him in gratitude. He hugged her. She hugged him back and then pulled him down on top of her on the bed again. He stuffed more money into her hand when they were finished this time and ran out of the room before she could begin hugging him in gratitude again. Back at his own apartment, he threw his things together as fast as he could, left for Nately what money he had, and ran back to Pianosa on a supply plant to apologize to Hungry Joe for shutting him out of the bedroom. The apology was unnecessary, for Hungry Joe was in high spirits when Yossarian found him. Hungry Joe was grinning from ear to ear, and Yossarian turned sick at the sight of him, for he understood instantly what the high spirits meant. "For our emissions," Hungry Joe announced readily in a voice lyrical with relief and elation. "The Colonel raised them again." Yossarian was stunned. "I've got 32! God damn it, 3 more and I would have been through!" Hungry Joe shrugged indifferently. "The Colonel wants more emissions," he repeated. Yossarian shoved him out of the way and ran right into the hospital. Yossarian ran into the hospital determined to remain there forever rather than fly one mission more than the 32 missions he had. 10 days after he changed his mind and came out, the colonel raised the missions to 45, and Yossarian ran right back in, determined to remain in the hospital forever rather than fly one mission more than the 6 missions more he had just flown. Yossarian could run into the hospital whenever he wanted to because of his liver and because of his eyes. The doctor couldn't fix his liver condition and couldn't meet his eyes each time he told him he had a liver condition. He could enjoy himself in the hospital just as long as there was no one really very sick in the same ward. There were usually not nearly as many sick people inside the hospital as the Yossarian saw outside the hospital, and there were generally fewer people inside the hospital who were seriously sick. There was a much lower death rate inside the hospital than outside the hospital, and a much healthier death rate. Few people died unnecessarily. People knew a lot more about dying inside the hospital and made a much neater, more orderly job of it. They couldn't dominate death inside the hospital, but they certainly made her behave. They had taught her manners. They couldn't keep death out, but while she was in, she had to act like a lady. People gave up the ghost with delicacy and taste inside the hospital. There was none of that crude, ugly ostentation about dying that was so common outside the hospital. They did not blow up in midair like Kraft or the dead man in Yossarian's tent, or freeze to death in the blazing summertime the way Snowden had frozen to death after spilling his secret to Yossarian in the back of the plane. "I'm cold," Snowden had whispered. "I'm cold." "There, there," Yossarian had tried to comfort him. "There, there." They didn't take it on the lam weirdly inside a cloud the way Clevenger had done. They didn't explode into blood and clotted matter. They didn't drown or get struck by lightning, mangled by machinery, or crushed in landslides. They didn't get shot to death in holdups, strangled to death in rapes, stabbed to death in saloons, bludgeoned to death with axes by parents or children, or die summarily by some other act of God. Nobody choked to death. People bled to death like gentlemen in an operating room, or expired without comment in an oxygen tent. There was none of that tricky now you see me, now you don't business so much in vogue outside the hospital. None of that now I am and now I ain't. There were no famines or floods. Children didn't suffocate in cradles or ice boxes or fall under trucks. No one was beaten to death. People didn't stick their heads into ovens with the gas on, jump in front of subway trains, or come plummeting like dead weights out of hotel windows with a whoosh, accelerating at the rate of 16 feet per second to land with a hideous plop on the sidewalk and die disgustingly there in public like an alpaca sack full of hairy strawberry ice cream, bleeding, pink toes awry. All things considered, Yossarian often preferred the hospital, even though it did have its faults. When he contemplated the many diseases and potential accidents threatening him, he was positively astounded that he had managed to survive in good health for as long as he had. It was miraculous. Each day he faced was another dangerous mission against mortality, and he had been surviving them for 28 years. Colonel Cathcart was a slick, successful, slipshod, unhappy man of 36 who lumbered when he walked and wanted to be a general. He was dashing and dejected, poised and chagrined. He was complacent and insecure, daring in the administrative stratagems he employed to bring himself to the attention of his superiors, and craven in his concern that his schemes might all backfire. He was handsome and unattractive, a swashbuckling, beefy, conceited man who was putting on fat and was tormented chronically by prolonged seizures of apprehension. Colonel Cathcart was conceited because he was a full colonel with a combat command at the age of only 36, and Colonel Cathcart was dejected because although he was already 36, he was still only a full colonel. Colonel Cathcart was tangled up in a menacing problem. Yossarian! Yossarian! The mere sound of that execrable, ugly name made his blood run cold and his breath come in labored gasps. The chaplain's first mention of the name Yossarian had tolled deep in his memory like a portentous gong. As soon as the latch of the door had clicked shut, the whole humiliating recollection of the naked man in formation came cascading down upon him in a mortifying, choking flood of stinging details. He began to perspire and tremble. There was a sinister and unlikely coincidence exposed that was too diabolical an implication to be anything less than the most hideous of omens. The name of the man who had stood naked in ranks that day to receive his distinguished flying cross from General Dreedel had also been Yossarian. And now it was a man named Yossarian who was threatening to make trouble over the 60 missions he had just ordered the men in his group to fly. Colonel Cathcart wondered gloomily if it was the same Yossarian. He climbed to his feet with an air of intolerable woe and began moving about his office. He felt himself in the presence of the mysterious. The naked man in formation, he conceded cheerlessly, had been a real black eye for him. So had the tampering with the bomb line before the mission to Bologna and the 7-day delay in destroying the bridge at Ferrara. Even though destroying the bridge at Ferrara finally, he remembered with glee, had been a real feather in his cap. Although losing a plane there the second time around, he recalled in dejection, had been another black eye. Even though he had won another real feather in his cap by getting a medal approved for the bombardier who had gotten him the real black eye in the first place by going around over the target twice. That bombardier's name, he remembered suddenly with another stupefying shock, had also been Yossarian. Now there were three. His viscous eyes bulged with astonishment. Intuition warned him that Yossarian, whoever he would eventually turn out to be, was destined to serve as his nemesis. He tried to recall, longingly, if Yossarian had been lost in that plane in the cloud, and realized that Yossarian could not possibly have been lost in that plane in the cloud. If he was still around now, raising such a big stink about having to fly a lousy 5 missions more. Maybe 60 missions were too many for the men to fly, Colonel Cathcart reasoned, if Yossarian objected to flying them. But he then remembered that forcing his men to fly more missions than everyone else was the most tangible achievement he had going for him. As Colonel Corn often remarked, the war was crawling with group commanders who were merely doing their duty, and it required just some sort of dramatic gesture like making his group fly more combat missions than any other bomber group to spotlight his unique qualities of leadership. Certainly none of the generals seemed to object to what he was doing, although as far as he could detect, they weren't particularly impressed either, which made him suspect that perhaps 60 combat missions were not nearly enough, and that he ought to increase the number at once to 70, 80, 100, or even 200, 300, or 6,000. Certainly he would be much better off under somebody suave like General Peckham than he was under somebody boorish and insensitive like General Dreedel, because General Peckham had the discernment, the intelligence, and the Ivy League background to appreciate and enjoy him at his full value, although General Peckham had never given the slightest indication that he appreciated or enjoyed him at all. Colonel Cathcart felt perceptive enough to realize that visible signals of recognition were never necessary between sophisticated, self-assured people like himself and General Peckham, who could warm to each other from a distance with innate mutual understanding. General Dreedel believes that the young men who took orders from him should be willing to give up their lives for their ideals, aspirations, and idiosyncrasies of the old men he took orders from. The officers and enlisted men in his command had identity for him only as military quantities. All he asked was that they do their work. Beyond that, they were free to do whatever they pleased. They were free, as Colonel Cathcart was free, to force their men to fly 60 missions if they chose, and they were free, as the Yossarian had been free, just to stand in formation naked if they wanted to, although General Dreedel's granite jaw swung open at the sight as he went striding dictatorially right down the line to make certain that there really was a man wearing nothing but moccasins waiting at attention in ranks to receive a medal from him. General Dreedel was speechless. Colonel Cathcart began to faint when he spied Yossarian, and Colonel Corn stepped up behind him and squeezed his arm in a strong grip. The silence was grotesque. "Well, I'll be damned," mumbled General Dreedel, and his ruddy monolithic face softened with amusement. "Why aren't you wearing clothes?" "I don't want to." "What do you mean you don't want to? Why the hell don't you want to?" "I just don't want to, sir." "Why isn't he wearing clothes?" General Dreedel demanded over his shoulder of Colonel Cathcart. "He's talking to you," Colonel Corn whispered over Colonel Cathcart's shoulder from behind, jabbing his elbow sharply into Colonel Cathcart's back. Why isn't he wearing clothes? Colonel Cathcart demanded of Colonel Corn with a look of acute pain, tenderly nursing the spot where Colonel Corn had just jabbed him. Why isn't he wearing clothes? Colonel Corn demanded of Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren. A man was killed in his plane over Avignon last week, and he bled all over him, Captain Wren replied. He swears he's never going to wear a uniform again. A man was killed in his plane over Avignon last week and bled all over him, Colonel Corn reported directly to General Dreedel. His uniform hasn't come back from the laundry yet. Well, where are his other uniforms? Uh, they're in the laundry too. Well, what about his underwear? General Dreedel demanded. All his underwear is in the laundry too, answered Colonel Corn. That sounds like a lot of crap to me, General Dreedel declared. It is a lot of crap, sir, Yossarian said. Don't you worry, sir, Colonel Cathcart promised General Dreedel with a threatening look at Yossarian. You have my personal word for it that this man will be severely punished. What the hell do I care if he's punished or not? General Dreedel replied with surprise and irritation. He just won a medal. If he wants to receive it without any clothes on, what the hell business is it of yours? Those are my sentiments exactly, sir, Colonel Cathcart echoed with resounding enthusiasm and mopped his brow with a damp white handkerchief. That was the mission on which Yossarian lost his nerve. Yossarian lost his nerve on the mission to Avignon because Snowden lost his guts. And Snowden lost his guts because their pilot that day was Whoople, who was only 15 years old. And their co-pilot was Dobbs, who was even worse, and who wanted Yossarian to join with him in a plot to murder Colonel Cathcart. Whoople was a good pilot, Yossarian knew, but he was only a kid. And Dobbs had no confidence in him either, and wrestled the controls away without warning after they had dropped their bombs, going berserk in midair and tipping the plane over into that heart-stopping, ear-splitting, indescribably petrifying, fatal dive that tore Yossarian's earphones free from the connection and hung him helplessly to the roof of the nose by the top of his head. Oh God, Yossarian had shrieked soundlessly as he felt them all falling. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God! He had shrieked beseechingly through lips that could not open as the plane fell and he dangled without any weight by the top of his head until Hoople managed to seize the controls back and leveled the plane out down inside the crazy, craggy patchwork canyon of crashing anti-aircraft fire from which they had climbed away and from which they would now have to escape again. Almost at once, there was a thud and a hole the size of a big fist in the plexiglass. Yossarian's cheeks were stinging with shimmering splinters. There was no blood. What happened? What happened? He cried, and trembled violently when he could not hear his own voice in his ears. He was cowed by the empty silence on the intercom, and almost too horrified to move as he crouched like a trapped mouse on his hands and knees and waited without daring to breathe until he finally spied the gleaming cylindrical jack plug of his headset swinging back and forth in front of his eyes and jammed it back into its receptacle with fingers that rattled. Oh God, he kept shrieking with no abatement of terror as the flak thumped and mushroomed all about him. Oh God! Dobbs was weeping when Yossarian jammed his jack plug back into the intercom system and was able to hear again. Help him, Dobbs was sobbing. Help him, help him! Help who? Help who? Yossarian called back. Help who? The bombardier, Dobbs cried. He doesn't answer. Help the bombardier. I'm the bombardier, Yossarian cried back at him. I'm the bombardier. I'm all right. Then help him, Dobbs wept. Help him. Help who? The radio gunner, Dobbs begged. Help the radio gunner. I'm cold, Snowden whispered feebly over the intercom system. Then in a bleat of plaintive agony, please help me. I'm cold. And Yossarian crept out through the crawlway and climbed up over the bomb bay and down into the rear section of the plane, where Snowden lay on the floor, wounded and freezing to death in a yellow splash of sunlight near the new tail gunner lying stretched out on the floor beside him in a dead faint. At the airfield, Yossarian climbed down the few steps of his plane naked, in a state of utter shock, with the Snowden smeared abundantly all over his bare heels and toes, knees, arms, and fingers, and pointed inside wordlessly toward where the young radio gunner lay freezing to death on the floor, beside the still younger tail gunner, who kept falling back into a dead faint each time he opened his eyes and saw Snowden dying. Dr. Nika draped a blanket around Yossarian's shoulders almost tenderly after Snowden had been removed from the plane and carried into an ambulance on a stretcher. He led Yossarian toward his jeep. McWatt helped, and the three drove in silence to the squadron medical tent, where McWatt and Dr. Nika guided Yossarian inside to a chair and washed Snowden off him with cold, wet balls of absorbent cotton. Dr. Nika gave him a pill, and a shot that put him to sleep for 12 hours. When Yossarian woke up and went to see him, Dr. Nika gave him another pill and a shot that put him to sleep for another 12 hours. When Yossarian woke up again and went to see him, Dr. Nika made ready to give him another pill and another shot. How long are you going to keep giving me those pills and shots? Yossarian asked him. Until you feel better. I feel all right now. Dr. Nika's fragile, suntanned forehead furrowed with surprise. Then why don't you put some clothes on? Why are you walking around naked? I don't want to wear a uniform anymore. Dr. Nika accepted the explanation and put away his hypodermic syringe. Are you sure you feel all right? I feel fine. I'm just a little logy from all those pills and shots you've been giving me. Yossarian went about his business with no clothes on all the rest of that day and was still naked late the next morning when Milo, after hunting everywhere else, finally found him sitting up in a tree, a small distance in back of the quaint little military cemetery at which Snowden was being buried. I've been looking all over for you, Milo called up to Yossarian from the ground reproachfully. You should have looked for me in this tree, Yossarian answered. I've been up here all morning. Come on down and taste this and tell me if it's good. It's very important. Yossarian shook his head. He sat nude on the lowest limb of the tree and balanced himself with both hands, grasping the bough directly above. He refused to budge, and Milo had no choice but to stretch both arms about the trunk in a distasteful hug and start climbing. He struggled upward clumsily, with loud grunts and wheezes, and his clothes were squashed and crooked by the time he pulled himself up high enough to hook a leg over the limb and pause for breath. His dress cap was askew and in danger of falling. Milo caught it just in time when it began slipping. Globules of perspiration glistened like transparent pearls around his mustache and swelled like opaque blisters under his eyes. Yossarian watched him impassively. Cautiously, Milo worked himself around in a half circle so that he could face Yossarian. He unwrapped tissue paper from something soft, round, and brown and handed it out to Yossarian. Please, taste this and let me know what you think. I'd like to serve it to the men. What is it? Asked Yossarian and took a big bite. Chocolate-covered cotton. Yossarian gagged convulsively and sprayed his big mouthful of chocolate-covered cotton right into Milo's face. Here, take it back, he spouted angrily. Jesus Christ, have you gone crazy? You didn't even take the goddamn seeds out. Give it a chance, will you? Milo begged. It can't be that bad. Is it really that bad? It's even worse. But I've got to make the mess halls feed it to the men. They'll never be able to swallow it. They've got to swallow it, Milo ordained with dictatorial grandeur, and almost broke his neck when he let go with one arm to wave a righteous finger in the air. Come on out here, Yossarian invited him. You'll be much safer and you can see everything. Gripping the bough above with both hands, Milo began inching his way out on the limb sideways with utmost care and apprehension. His face was rigid with tension, and he sighed with relief when he found himself seated securely beside Yossarian. He stroked the tree affectionately. This is a pretty good tree, he observed admiringly with proprietary gratitude. It's the tree of life, Yossarian answered, waggling his toes. And of knowledge of good and evil, too. Milo squinted closely at the bark and branches. No, it isn't, he replied. It's a chestnut tree. I ought to know. I sell chestnuts. Have it your way. They sat in the tree without talking for several seconds, their legs dangling and their hands almost straight up the bough above, the one completely nude but for a pair of crepe-soled sandals, the other completely dressed in a coarse olive-drab woolen uniform with his tie knotted tight. Milo studied Yossarian diffidently through the corner of his eye, hesitating tactfully. I want to ask you something, he said at last. You don't have any clothes on. I don't want to butt in or anything, but I just want to know. Why aren't you wearing a uniform? I don't want to. Milo nodded rapidly like a sparrow pecking. I see, he stated quickly with a look of vivid confusion. I understand perfectly. I heard Appleby and Captain Black say you had gone crazy, and I just wanted to find out. He hesitated politely again, weighing his next question. Are you ever going to put your uniform on again? I don't think so. Milo nodded with spurious vim to indicate he still understood and then sat silent, ruminating gravely with troubled misgiving. Yossarian and Milo were covered in their bower by tissue-thin tiers of sloping green, and largely surrounded by other gray chestnut trees and a silver spruce. The sun was high overhead in a vast sapphire blue sky beaded with low, isolated, puffy clouds of dry and immaculate white. There was no breeze, and the leaves about them hung motionless. The shade was feathery. Everything was at peace but Milo, who straightened suddenly with a muffled cry and began pointing excitedly. Look at that! He exclaimed in alarm. Look at that! That's a funeral going on down there. That looks like the cemetery, isn't it? Yossarian answered him slowly in a level voice. They're burying that kid who got killed in my plane over Avignon the other day. Snowden. What happened to him? Milo asked in a voice deadened with awe. He got killed. That's terrible, Milo grieved, and his large brown eyes filled with tears. That poor kid. That really is terrible. He bit his trembling lip hard, and his voice rose with emotion when he continued. And it will get even worse if the mess halls don't agree to buy my cotton. Yossarian, what's the matter with them? Don't they realize it's their syndicate? Don't they know they've all got a share? Is it my fault that I saw this great opportunity to corner the market on Egyptian cotton and get us all into this trouble? Was I supposed to know there was going to be a glut? I didn't even know what a glut was in those days. An opportunity to corner a market doesn't come along very often, and I was pretty shrewd to grab the chance while I had it. Milo gulped back a moan as he saw 6 uniformed pallbearers lift the plain pine coffin from the ambulance and set it gently down on the ground beside the yawning gash of the freshly dug grave. And now I can't get rid of a single penny's worth, he mourned. Yossarian was unmoved by the fustian charade of the burial ceremony, and by Milo's crushing bereavement. The chaplain's voice floated up to him through the distance, tenuously, in an unintelligible, almost inaudible monotone, like a gaseous murmur. As Yossarian stared, the chaplain elevated his gaze towards Yossarian beatifically, pressed his fingers down over his eyeballs in a manner of affliction, peered upward again towards Yossarian searchingly, and bowed his head, concluding what Yossarian took to be a climatic part of the funeral rite. The 4 men in fatigues lifted the coffin on slings and lowered it into the grave. Milo shuddered violently. I can't watch it, he cried, turning away in anguish. I just can't sit here and watch while those mess halls let my syndicate die. I wish you'd put your uniform on instead of going around naked that way, he confided pensively before he climbed back down again and hurried away. You might start a trend, and then I'd never get rid of all this god-darn cotton. Yossarian no longer gave a damn where his bombs fell. As the lead bombardier, Yossarian had McWatt for a pilot, and that was one consolation, although he was still so utterly undefended. There was no way to fight back. He could not even see McWatt and the co-pilot from his post in the nose. All he could ever see was Artfie, with whose fustian, moon-faced ineptitude he had finally lost all patience. And there were minutes of agonizing fury and frustration in the sky, when he hungered to be demoted again to a wing plane with a loaded machine gun in the compartment instead of the precision bomb sight that he really had no need for. A powerful, heavy, 50 caliber machine gun he could seize vengefully in both hands and turn loose savagely against all the demons tyrannizing him. Actually, there was not much he could do with that powerful machine gun except load it and test fire a few rounds. It was no more use to him than the bomb sight. He could really cut loose with it against attacking German fighters. But there were no German fighters anymore, and he could not even swing it all the way around into the helpless faces of pilots like Hoople and Dobbs and order them back down carefully to the ground, as he had once ordered Kid Sampson back down, which is exactly what he did want to do to Dobbs and Hoople on the hideous first mission to Avignon, the moment he realized the fantastic pickle he was in, the moment he found himself aloft in a wing plane with Dobbs and Hoople in a flight headed by Havermeyer and Appleby. Dobbs and Hoople, Hoople and Dobbs, who were they? What preposterous madness to float in thin air 2 miles high on an inch or two of metal, sustained from death by the meager skill and intelligence of two vapid strangers, a beardless kid named Hoople and a nervous nut like Dobbs, who really did go nuts right there in the plane, running amok over the target without leaving his co-pilot's seat and grabbing the controls from Hoople to plunge them all down into that chilling dive that tore Yossarian's headset loose and brought them right back inside the dense flak from which they had almost escaped. The next thing he knew, another stranger, a radio gunner named Snowden, was dying in the back. It was impossible to be positive that Dobbs had killed him, for when Yossarian plugged his headset back in, Dobbs was already on the intercom pleading for someone to go up front and help the bombardier. And almost immediately Snowden broke in, whimpering, "Help me, please help me, I'm cold, I'm cold." And Yossarian crawled slowly out of the nose and up on top of the bomb bay and wriggled back into the rear section of the plane, passing the first aid kit on the way that he had to return for, to treat Snowden for the wrong wound, the yawning, raw, melon-shaped hole as big as a football on the outside of his thigh, the unsevered, blood-soaked muscle fibers inside pulsating weirdly like blind things with lives of their own, the oval, naked wound that was almost a foot long and made Yossarian moan in shock and sympathy The instant he spied it nearly made him vomit, and the small, slight tail gunner was lying on the floor beside Snowden in a dead faint, his face as white as a handkerchief, so that Yossarian sprang forward with revulsion to help him first. Yes, in the long run, he was much safer flying with McWatt, and he was not even safe with McWatt, who loved flying too much and went buzzing boldly inches off the ground with Yossarian in the nose on the way back from the training flight to break in the new bombardier and the whole replacement crew Colonel Cathcart had obtained after Orr was lost. The practice bomb range was on the other side of Pianosa, and flying back, McWatt edged the belly of the lazing, slow-cruising plane just over the crest of mountains in the middle, and then, instead of maintaining altitude, jolted both engines open all the way, lurched up on one side, and, to Yossarian's astonishment, began following the falling land down as fast as the plane would go, wagging his wings gaily and skimming with a massive, grinding, hammering roar over each rocky rise and dip of the rolling terrain, like a dizzy gull over wild brown waves. Yossarian was petrified. The new bombardier beside him sat demurely, with a bewitched grin, and kept whistling, "Whee!" And Yossarian wanted to reach out and crush his idiotic face with one hand as he flinched and flung himself away from the boulders and hillocks and lashing branches of trees that loomed up above him out in front and rushed past just underneath in a sinking, streaking blur. No one had a right to take such frightful risks with his life. "Go up! Go up! Go up!" he shouted frantically at McWatt, hating him venomously. But McWatt was singing buoyantly over the intercom and probably couldn't hear. Yossarian, blazing with rage and almost sobbing for revenge, hurled himself down into the crawlway and fought his way through against the dragging weight of gravity and inertia until he arrived at the main section and pulled himself up to the flight deck to stand trembling behind McWatt in the pilot's seat. He looked desperately about for a gun, a gray-black .45 automatic that he could cock and ram right up against the base of McWatt's skull. There was no gun. There was no hunting knife either, and no other weapon with which he could bludgeon or stab. And Yossarian grasped and jerked the collar of McWatt's coverall in tightening fists and shouted to him to go up, go up. The land was still swimming by underneath and flashing by overhead on both sides. McWatt looked back at Yossarian and laughed joyfully as though Yossarian were sharing his fun. Yossarian slid both hands around McWatt's bare throat and squeezed. McWatt turned stiff. "Go up!" Yossarian ordered unmistakably through his teeth in a low, menacing voice, "or I'll kill you!" Rigid with caution, McWatt cut the motors back and climbed gradually. Yossarian's hands weakened on McWatt's net and slid down off his shoulders to dangle inertly. He was not angry anymore. He was ashamed. When McWatt turned, he was sorry the hands were his and wished there were some place where he could bury them. They felt dead. McWatt gazed at him deeply. There was no friendliness in his stare. "Boy," he said coldly, "you sure must be in pretty bad shape. You ought to go home." "They won't let me," Yossarian answered with averted eyes, and crept away. Yossarian stepped down from the flight deck and seated himself on the floor, hanging his head with guilt and remorse. He was covered with sweat. McWatt set course directly back toward the field. Yossarian wondered whether McWatt would now go to the operations tent to see Pilchard and Wren and request that Yossarian never be assigned to his plane again, just as Yossarian had gone surreptitiously to speak to them about Dobbs and Hoople and Orr, and unsuccessfully about Arfi. He had never seen McWatt look displeased before, had never seen him in any but the most light-hearted mood, and he wondered whether he had just lost another friend. But McWatt winked at him reassuringly as he climbed down from the plane and joshed hospitably with the credulous new pilot and bombardier during the jeep ride back to the squadron, although he did not address a word to Yossarian until all four had returned their parachutes and separated, and the two of them were walking side by side toward their own row of tents. Then McWatt's sparsely freckled, tan, Scotch-Irish face broke suddenly into a smile, and he dug his knuckles playfully into Yossarian's ribs as though throwing a punch. "You louse," he laughed. "Were you really going to kill me up there?" Yossarian grinned penitently and shook his head. "No, I don't think so." "I didn't realize you got it so bad. Boy, why don't you talk to somebody about it?" "I talk to everybody about it. What the hell's the matter with you? Don't you ever hear me?" "Well, I guess I never really believed you." "Aren't you ever afraid?" Maybe I ought to be. Not even on the missions?" "I guess I just don't have brains enough." McWatt laughed sheepishly. There's so many ways for me to get killed, Yossarian commented, and you have to find one more. McWatt smiled again. See, I bet it really must scare you when I buzz your tent, huh? It scares me to death. I told you that. I thought it was just the noise you were complaining about. McWatt made a resigned shrug. Oh, well, what the hell, he's saying. I guess I'll just have to give it up. But McWatt was incorrigible. And while he never buzzed Yossarian's tent again, he never missed an opportunity to buzz the beach and roar like a fierce and low-flying thunderbolt over the raft in the water and the secluded hollow in the sand where Yossarian lay feeling up Nurse Duckett. Yossarian met Nurse Duckett almost every afternoon that both were free and came with her to the beach. Evenings, when Yossarian felt horny, he brought Nurse Duckett to the beach with 2 blankets and enjoyed making love to her with most of their clothes on more than he sometimes enjoyed making love to all the vigorous, bare, amoral girls in Rome. Yossarian was never lonely with Nurse Duckett, who really did know how to keep her mouth shut and was just capricious enough. He was haunted and tormented by the vast, boundless ocean. He wondered mournfully, as Nurse Duckett buffed her nails, about all the people who had died underwater. There were surely more than 1,000,000 already. Where were they? What insects had eaten their flesh? He imagined the awful impotence of breathing in helplessly quarts and quarts of water. Yossarian followed the small fishing boats and military launches plying back and forth far out, and found them unreal. It did not seem true that there were full-sized men aboard, going somewhere every time. He looked toward Stony Elba, and his eyes automatically searched overhead for the fluffy white turnip-shaped cloud in which Clevenger had vanished. He peered at the vaporous Italian skyline and thought of Orr. Clevenger and Orr. Where are they gone? Yossarian had once stood on a jetty at dawn and watched the tufted round log that was drifting toward him on the tide turn unexpectedly into the bloated face of a drowned man. It was the first dead person he had ever seen. He thirsted for life and reached up ravenously to grasp and hold Nurse Duckett's flesh. He studied every floating object fearfully for some gruesome sign of Clevenger and Orr, preparing for any morbid shock but the shock McWatt gave him one day, with a plane that came blasting suddenly into sight out of the distant stillness and hurled mercilessly along the shoreline with a great, growling, clattering roar over the bobbing raft on which blond, pale Kid Sampson, his naked sides scrawny even from so far away, leaped clownishly up to touch it at the exact moment some arbitrary gust of wind or minor miscalculation of McWatt's senses dropped the speeding plane down just low enough for a propeller to slice him half away. Even people who were not there remembered vividly exactly what happened next. There was the briefest, softest, filtering audibly through the shattering, overwhelming howl of the plane's engines. And then there were just Kid Sampson's 2 pale, skinny legs, still joined by strings somehow at the bloody, truncated hips, standing stock still on the raft for what seemed like a full minute or two before they toppled over backward into the water, finally, with a faint, echoing splash, and turned completely upside down so that only the grotesque toes and the plaster-white soles of Kid Sampson's feet remained in view. Everyone at the beach was screaming and running, and the men sounded like women. They scampered for their things in panic, stooping hurriedly and looking askance at each gentle, knee-high wave, bubbling in as though some ugly red grisly organ like a liver or a lung might come washing right up against them. Those in the water were struggling to get out, forgetting in their haste to swim, wailing, walking, held back in their flight by viscous, clinging sea, as though by a biting wind. Kid Sampson had rained all over. Those who spied drops of him on their limbs or torsos drew back with terror and revulsion, as though trying to shrink away from their own odious skins. Everybody ran in a sluggish stampede, shooting tortured, horrified glances back, filling the deep, shadowy, rustling woods with their frail gasps and cries. Back at the squadron, everybody already knew. Men in uniform were screaming and running there too, or standing motionless in one spot, rooted in awe, like Sergeant Knight and Dr. Nika as they gravely craned their heads upward and watched the guilty, banking, forlorn airplane with McWatt circle and circle slowly and climb. Who is it? Yossarian shouted anxiously at Dr. Nika as he ran up, breathless and limp, his somber eyes burning with a misty, hectic anguish. Who's in the plane? McWatt, said Sergeant Knight. He's got the 2 new pilots with him on a training flight. Dr. Nika's up there, too. I'm right here, contended Dr. Nika in a strange and troubled voice, darting an anxious look at Sergeant Knight. Why doesn't he come down? Yossarian exclaimed in despair. Why does he keep going up? He's probably afraid to come down, Sergeant Knight answered, without moving his solemn gaze from McWatt's solitary climbing airplane. He knows what kind of trouble he's in. And McWatt kept flying higher and higher, nosing his droning airplane upward, even in a slow oval spiral that carried him far out over the water as he headed south and far in over the russet foothills when he had circled the landing field again and was flying north. He was soon up over 5,000 feet. His engines were soft as whispers. A white parachute popped open suddenly in a surprising puff. A second parachute popped open a few minutes later and coasted down, like the first, directly in towards the clearing of the landing strip. There was no motion on the ground. The plane continued south for 30 seconds more, following the same pattern, familiar and predictable now. And McWatt lifted a wing and banked gracefully around into his turn. Two more to go, said Sergeant Knight. McWatt and Dr. Nika. I'm right here, Sergeant Knight, Dr. Nika told him plaintively. I'm not in the plane. Why don't they jump? Sergeant Knight asked, tweeting aloud to himself. Why don't they jump? It doesn't make sense, grieved Dr. Nika, biting his lip. It just doesn't make sense. But Yossarian understood suddenly why McWatt wouldn't jump, and went running uncontrollably down the whole length of the squadron after McWatt's plane, waving his arms and shouting up at him imploringly to come down. McWatt, come down! But no one seemed to hear, certainly not McWatt, and a great choking moan tore from Yossarian's throat as McWatt turned again, dipped his wings once in salute, decided, oh well, what the hell, and flew into a mountain. Colonel Cathcart was so upset by the deaths of Kid Sampson and McWatt that he raised the missions to 65. When Colonel Cathcart learned that Dr. Nika too had been killed in McWatt's plane, he increased the number of missions to 70. Yossarian marched backward with his gun on his hip and refused to fly any more missions. He marched backward because he was continuously spinning around as he walked to make certain no one was sneaking up on him from behind. Every sound to his rear was a warning. Every person he passed, a potential assassin. He kept his hand on his gun butt constantly and smiled at no one but Hungry Joe. He told Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren that he was through flying. Captain Pilchard and Captain Wren left his name off the flight schedule for the next mission and reported the matter to group headquarters. Colonel Corn laughed calmly. What the devil do you mean you won't fly more missions? He asked with a smile, as Colonel Cathcart crept away into a corner to brood about the sinister import of the name Yossarian popping up to plague him once again. Why won't he? His friend Nadley was killed in the crash over Spezia. Maybe that's why. Who does he think he is, Achilles? Colonel Corn was pleased with the simile and filed a mental reminder to repeat it the next time he found himself in General Peckham's presence. He has to fly more missions. He has no choice. Go back and tell him you'll report the matter to us if he doesn't change his mind. We already did tell him that, sir. It made no difference. What does Major say? We never see Major. He seems to have disappeared. I wish we could disappear him, Colonel Cathcart blurted out from the corner peevishly. The way they did that fellow Dunbar. Oh, there are plenty of other ways we can handle this one, Colonel Corn assured him confidently, and continued to Pilchard and Wren. Let's begin with the kindest. Send him to Rome for a rest for a few days. Maybe this fellow's death really did hurt him a bit. Nadley's death, in fact, almost killed Yossarian too. For when he broke the news to Nately's whore in Rome, she uttered a piercing, heartbroken shriek and tried to stab him to death with a potato peeler. Brutta! She howled at him in hysterical fury as he bent her arm up around behind her back and twisted gradually until the potato peeler dropped from her grasp. Brutto, brutto! She lashed at him swiftly with the long-nailed fingers of her free hand and raked open his cheek. She spat in his face viciously. What do you want from me? He yelled at her in whiny and exasperated confusion. I didn't kill him. She hurled a heavy glass ashtray at his head, screaming, Brutto, brutto, each time he tried to explain. He had no idea what to do. She burst unpredictably into tears. He was stunned again. Please, he urged her inarticulately, with his arm about her shoulders, recollecting with pained sadness how inarticulate and enfeebled he had felt in the plane coming back from Avignon, when Snowden kept whimpering to him that he was cold, and all Yossarian could offer him in return was, there. Please, he repeated to her sympathetically. Please. She rested against him and cried until she seemed too weak to cry any longer, and did not look at him once until he extended his handkerchief when she had finished. She wiped her cheeks with a tiny, polite smile and gave the handkerchief back, murmuring, Grazie, grazie, with meek, maidenly propriety. And then, without any warning whatsoever of her change in mood, clawed suddenly at his eyes with both hands. She landed with each and let out a victorious shriek. Ha! Assassino! She hooted, and raced joyously across the room for the bread knife to finish him off. Half blinded, he rose and stumbled after her. A noise behind him made him turn. His senses reeled in horror as what he saw. Nadley's Orr's kid sister, of all people, was coming after him with another long bread knife. Oh no, he wailed with a shudder, and he knocked the knife out of her hand with a sharp downward blow on her wrist. He lost patience entirely with the whole grotesque and incomprehensible melee. There was no telling who might lunge at him next through the doorway with another long bread knife, and he lifted Nadley's Orr's kid sister off the floor, threw her at Nadley's floor, and ran out of the room, out of the apartment, and down the stairs. Yossarian escaped, but he kept looking back over his shoulder anxiously as he retreated through the street. He did not feel really safe until the plane had taken off. When they landed at Pianosa, Nadley's Orr, disguised in a mechanic's green overalls, was waiting with her steak knife exactly where the plane stopped. And all that saved him, as she stabbed at his chest in her leather-soled, high-heeled shoes, was the gravel underfoot that made her feet roll out from under her. Yossarian went to the Officers' Club that night, and he stayed very late. He kept a leery eye out for Nadley's Orr as he approached his tent. A figure reared up in the darkness right beside the path, and he fainted. He came to, sitting on the ground, and waited for the knife to strike him, almost welcoming the mortal blow for the peace it would bring. A friendly hand helped him up instead. It belonged to a pilot in Dunbar's squadron. How you doing? Asked the pilot, whispering. Pretty good, Yossarian answered. There's a rumor in my squadron that you told him you weren't going to fly any more combat missions. That's the truth. You think they'll let you get away with it? I don't know. You think they'll court-martial you for desertion in the face of the enemy? I don't know. Well, I hope you get away with it, said the pilot in Dunbar's squadron, stealing out of sight into the shadows. Let me know how you're doing. All evening, people kept popping up at him out of the darkness to ask him how he was doing, appealing to him for confidential information with weary, troubled faces on the basis of some morbid clandestine kinship he had not guessed existed. People in the squadron he barely knew popped into sight out of nowhere as he passed and asked him how he was doing. Yossarian drew near each beckoning, overly cautious silhouette with his hand on his gun, never knowing which hissing shadow would finally turn dishonestly into Nadley's Orr, or worse, into some duly constituted government authority sent to club him ruthlessly into insensibility. Yossarian was going absent without official leave with Milo, who, as the plane cruised toward Rome, shook his head reproachfully, and with pious lips pursed, informed Yossarian in ecclesiastical tones that he was ashamed of it. Yossarian nodded. Yossarian was making an uncouth spectacle of himself by walking around backward with his gun on his hip and refusing to fly more combat missions, Milo said. Yossarian nodded. The men with 70 missions were starting to grumble because they had to fly 80, and there was a danger some of them might put on guns and begin walking around backward too. Morale was deteriorating, and it was all Yossarian's fault. The country was in peril. He was jeopardizing his traditional rights of freedom and independence by daring to exercise them. Yossarian kept nodding in the co-pilot's seat and tried not to listen as Milo prattled on. Nately's Orr was on his mind, as were Kraft and Orr and Nately and Dunbar and Kid Sampson and McGuat and all the poor and stupid and diseased people he had seen in Italy, Egypt, and North Africa and knew about in other areas of the world. And Snowden and Nately's Orr's kid sister was on his conscience too. Rome was in ruins, he saw, when the plane was down. Nately's Orr's apartment was a shambles. The girls were gone, and the only one there was an old woman. Gone, she moaned before he could even inquire. Chased away into the street. All of them gone. All the poor young girls. Chased away by who? Who did it? The mean tall soldiers with the hard white hats and clubs. What right did they have? Yossarian asked. Catch-22. What? Yossarian froze in his tracks with fear and alarm, and felt his whole body begin to tingle. What did you say? Catch-22, the old woman repeated, rocking her head up and down. Catch-22. Catch-22 says they have a right to do anything we can't stop them from doing. What the hell are you talking about? Yossarian shouted at her in bewildered, furious protest. How did you know it was Catch-22? Who the hell told you it was Catch-22? The soldiers with the hard white hats and clubs. The girls were crying. Did we do anything wrong? They said. The men said no and pushed them away out the doors with the ends of their clubs. Then why are you chasing us out? The girl said. Catch-22, the men said. What right do you have? The girl said. Catch-22, the man said. All they kept saying was Catch-22, Catch-22. What does it mean, Catch-22? What is Catch-22? Didn't they show it to you? Yossarian demanded, stampeding about in anger and distress. Didn't you even make them read it? They don't have to show us Catch-22, the old woman answered. The law says they don't have to. What law says they don't have to? Catch-22. Oh, god damn, Yossarian exclaimed bitterly. I bet it wasn't even really there. Then the door to the apartment flew open, and two large, tough, brawny MPs with icy eyes and firm, sinewy, unsmiling jaws entered quickly, strode across the room, and arrested Yossarian. They arrested Yossarian for being in Rome without a pass. Colonel Corn sat on a corner of Colonel Cathcart's desk, and with a genial smile said to Yossarian, "We're sending you home." There was, of course, a catch. Catch-22? Inquired Yossarian. Of course, Colonel Corn answered pleasantly. After all, we can't simply send you home for refusing to fly more missions and keep the rest of the men here, can we? That would hardly be fair to them. You're goddamn right, Colonel Cathcart blurted out. It took a bit of thinking, said Colonel Corn. But we finally worked out this horrible little plan for sending you home without causing too much dissatisfaction among the friends you'll leave behind. Doesn't that make you happy? What kind of plan? I'm not sure I'm going to like it. Huh. I know you're not going to like it, Colonel Corn laughed, locking his hands contentedly on top of his head again. You're going to loathe it. Well, you'll agree to it quickly enough. It's that or a court-martial. Take it or leave it. What must I do? Colonel Corn laughed curtly. Like us. Yossarian blanked. Like you? Like us. Like you. That's right, said Colonel Corn, nodding, gratified immeasurably by Yossarian's guileless surprise and bewilderment. Like us. Join us. Be our pal. Say nice things about us here and back in the States. Become one of the boys. Well, that isn't asking too much, is it? What will I say to the men who ask me why I refuse to fly more missions? Well, tell them that you had been informed in confidence that you were being returned to the States and that you are unwilling to risk your life for another mission or two. Just a minor disagreement between pals, that's all. That's a pretty scummy trick I'd be playing on the men of the squadron, isn't it? Odious, Colonel Corn agreed amiably, and waited, watching Yossarian patiently with a glimmer of private delight. Well, what the hell, Yossarian exclaimed. If they don't want to fly more missions, let them stand up and do something about it the way I did, right? Of course, said Colonel Corn. There's no reason I have to risk my life for them, is there? Of course not. Yossarian arrived at his decision with a swift grin. It's a deal, he announced jubilantly. Yossarian waved goodbye fondly to his new pals and sauntered out onto the balcony corridor, almost bursting into song the instant he was alone. He was home free. He had pulled it off. His act of rebellion had succeeded. He was safe, and he had nothing to be ashamed of to anyone. He started toward the staircase with a jaunty and exhilarated air. A private in green fatigues saluted him. Yossarian returned the salute happily, staring at the private with curiosity. He looked strangely familiar. When Yossarian returned the salute, the private in green fatigues turned suddenly to Nately's horror and lunged at him murderously with a bone-handled kitchen knife that caught him in the side below his upraised arm. Yossarian sank to the floor with a shriek, shutting his eyes in overwhelming terror as he saw the girl lift the knife to strike at him again. He was already unconscious when Colonel Corn and Colonel Cathcart dashed out of the office and saved his life by frightening her away. Cut, said a doctor. You cut, said another. No cut, said Yossarian with a thick, unwieldy tongue. Now look who's butting in, complained one of the doctors. Another count he heard from. Are we going to operate or aren't we? He doesn't need an operation, complained the other. It's a small wound. All we have to do is stop the bleeding, clean it out, and put in a few stitches. But I'd never had a chance to operate before. Which one is the scalpel? Is this one the scalpel? Yossarian let his eyes fall closed and hoped they would think he was unconscious. Let's operate, said the other doctor. Let's cut him open and get to the inside of things once and for all. He keeps complaining about his liver. Well, his liver looks pretty small on this x-ray. They gave Yossarian total anesthesia and knocked him out. He woke up thirsty in a private room, drowning in ether fumes. The chaplain was there. I'm happy about you, the chaplain replied with excited candor and joy. I heard at group that you were very seriously injured and that you would have to be sent home if you lived. You know, Yossarian, we're all very proud of you. Proud? Yes, of course. For risking your life to stop that Nazi assassin. It was a very noble thing to do. What Nazi assassin? The one that came here to murder Colonel Cathcart and Colonel Corn, and you saved them. Would you let them send you home? I don't know. Is it hot out? It's very warm in here. No, it's very cold out, the chaplain said. The chaplain left without saying goodbye. It was dark in the hospital and perfectly quiet. Yossarian had no watch to tell him the time. He was wide awake, and he knew he was a prisoner in one of those sleepless, bedridden nights that would take an eternity to dissolve into dawn. He was cold, and he thought of Snowden, who had never been his pal, but was a vaguely familiar kid who was badly wounded and freezing to death in the puddle of harsh yellow sunlight, splashing into his face through the side gun port when Yossarian crawled into the rear section of the plane over the bomb bay after Dobbs had beseeched him on the intercom to help the gunner. Please, help the gunner. Yossarian's stomach turned over when his eyes first beheld the macabre scene. He was absolutely revolted, and he paused in fright a few moments before descending, crouched on his hands and knees in the narrow tunnel over the bomb bay, beside the sealed corrugated carton containing the first aid kit. Snowden was lying on his back on the floor with his legs stretched out, still burdened cumbersomely by his flak suit, his flak helmet, his parachute harness, and his Mae West. Not far away on the floor lay the small tail gunner in a dead faint. The wound Yossarian saw was in the outside of Snowden's thigh, as large and deep as a football, it seemed. It was impossible to tell where the shreds of his saturated coveralls ended and the ragged flesh began. I'm cold, Snowden said softly. I'm cold. You're gonna be all right, kid, Yossarian reassured him with a grin. You're gonna be all right. I'm cold, Snowden said again in a frail, childlike voice. I'm cold. There, Yossarian said, because he didn't know what else to say. There. I'm cold, Snowden whimpered. I'm cold. There. Yossarian was frightened and moved more swiftly. He found a pair of scissors at last and began cutting carefully through Snowden's coveralls high up above the wound, just below the groin. He cut through the heavy gabardine cloth all the way around the thigh in a straight line. The tiny tail gunner woke up while Yossarian was cutting with the scissors, saw him, and fainted again. Snowden rolled his head to the other side of his neck in order to stare at Yossarian more directly. A dim, sunken light glowed in his weakened, listless eyes. Yossarian, puzzled, tried not to look at him. He began cutting downward through the coveralls along the inside seam. The yawning wound, was that a tube of slimy bone he saw running deep inside the weird muscle? Was dripping blood in several trickles, like snow melting on eaves, but viscous and red, already thickening as it dropped. Yossarian kept cutting through the coveralls to the bottom and peeled open the severed leg of the garment. It fell to the floor with a plop, exposing the hem of khaki undershorts that were soaking up blotches of blood on one side, as though in thirst. The wound he saw now was not nearly as large as a football. The blood was already coagulating inside the wound, and it was simply a matter of bandaging him up and keeping him calm until the plane landed. Snowden quivered when Yossarian pressed against him gently to turn it slightly on his side. Did I hurt you? I'm cold, Snowden whimpered. I'm cold. There, Yossarian said. There. I'm cold. You're gonna be all right, kid, Yossarian assured him, patting his arm comfortingly. Everything's under control. Snowden shook his head feebly. I'm cold, he repeated, with eyes as dull and blind as stone. I'm cold. There, said Yossarian with growing doubt and trepidation. There. In a little while, we'll be back on the ground, and Dr. Nika will take care of you. But Snowden kept shaking his head and pointing at last, with just the barest movement of his chin, down toward his armpit. Yossarian bent forward to peer. and saw a strangely colored stain seeping through the coveralls just above the armhole of Snowden's black suit. Yossarian felt his heart stop, then pound so violently he found it difficult to breathe. Snowden was wounded inside his black suit. Yossarian ripped open the snaps of Snowden's black suit and heard himself scream wildly as Snowden's inside slid down to the floor in a soggy pile and just kept dripping out. A chunk of flak more than 3 inches big had shot into his other side, just underneath the arm, and blasted all the way through, drawing whole mottled quarts of Snowden along with it through the gigantic hole in his ribs it made as it blasted out. Yossarian screamed a second time and squeezed both hands over his eyes. His teeth were chattering in horror. He forced himself to look again. Here was God's plenty, all right, he thought bitterly as he stared. Liver, lungs, kidneys, ribs, stomach, and bits of the stewed tomatoes Snowden had eaten that day for lunch. Yossarian hated stewed tomatoes and turned away dizzily and began to vomit, clutching his burning throat. The tail gunner woke up while Yossarian was vomiting, saw him, and fainted again. Yossarian was limp with exhaustion, pain, and despair when he finished. He turned back weakly to Snowden, whose breath had grown softer and more rapid, and whose face had grown paler. He wondered how in the world to begin to save him. "I'm cold," Snowden whispered. "I'm cold." There, Yossarian mumbled mechanically in a voice too low to be heard. There. Yossarian was cold too, and shivering uncontrollably. He felt goose pimples clacking all over him as he gazed down despondently at the grim secret Snowden had spilled all over the messy floor. It was easy to read the message in his entrails. Man was matter. That was Snowden's secret. Drop him out a window and he'll fall. Set fire to him and he'll burn. Bury him and he'll rot like other kinds of garbage. The spirit gone, man is garbage. That was Snowden's secret. Rightness was all. "I'm cold," Snowden said. "I'm cold." There, said Yossarian. There. He pulled the ripcord of Snowden's parachute and covered his body with the white nylon sheets. "I'm cold." There. "Danby, must I really let them send me home?" Yossarian inquired of him seriously. Major Danby shrugged. "It's a way to save yourself. It's a way to lose myself, Danby. You ought to know that. You can have lots of things you want." "I don't want lots of things I want," Yossarian replied, and then beat his fist down against the mattress in an outburst of rage and frustration. "God damn it, Danby. I've got friends who were killed in this war. I can't make a deal now. Getting stabbed by that bitch was the best thing that ever happened to me." Footsteps exploded in the corridor suddenly, and the chaplain, shouting at the top of his voice, came bursting into the room with the electrifying news about Orr, so overcome with hilarious excitement that he was almost sparkling in his eyes, and Yossarian leaped right out of bed with an incredulous yelp when he finally understood. "Sweden?" he cried. "Sweden!" cried the chaplain. "It's a miracle, I tell you. A miracle! I believe in God again. I really do. Washed ashore in Sweden after so many weeks at sea? It's a miracle. What? Washed ashore hell," Yossarian declared, jumping all about also, and roaring in laughing exultation at the walls, the ceiling, the chaplain, and Major Danby. "He didn't wash ashore in Sweden. He rode there. He rode there, chaplain. He rode there." "Rode there? He planned it that way. He went to Sweden deliberately." "Have you gone crazy?" Major Danby demanded with alarm and bewilderment. "Yossarian, would you please tell me what you are talking about?" "I'm going to run away," Yossarian announced in an exuberant, clear voice, already tearing open the buttons of his pajama tops. "Oh, no," Major Danby groaned. "To Sweden?" Major Danby exclaimed in astonishment. "You're going to run to Sweden? Are you crazy? Or did it?" "Oh, no," Major Danby pleaded. "No, Yossarian, you'll never get there. You can't run away to Sweden. You can't even row. But I can get to Rome if you'll keep your mouth shut when you leave here and give me a chance to catch a ride. Will you do it?" "But they'll find you," Major Danby argued desperately, "and bring you back and punish you even more severely. They'll have to try like hell to catch me this time." "They will try like hell. And even if they don't find you, what kind of way is that to live? You'll always be alone. No one will ever be on your side, and you'll always live in danger of betrayal." "I live that way now." "You'll never make it. It's impossible. It's almost a geographical impossibility to get there from here." "Hell, Danby, I know that. But at least I'll be trying. There's a young kid in Rome whose life I'd like to save if I can find her. I'll take her to Sweden with me if I can find her, so it isn't all selfish, is it?" "It's absolutely insane." Your conscience will never let you rest. God bless it, Yossarian laughed. I wouldn't want to live without strong misgivings, right, Chaplain? What about the disgrace? Demanded Major Danby. Are you going to stop me? Yossarian asked Major Danby and gazed at him steadily. Major Danby skipped away from the chaplain and hesitated a moment longer. No, of course not, he blurted out, and suddenly was waving both arms toward the door in a gesture of exuberant urgency. Of course I won't stop you. Go, for God's sakes, and hurry. Do you need any money? I have some money. Well, here's some more. With fervent, excited enthusiasm, Major Danby pressed the thick wad of Italian currency upon Yossarian and clasped his hands in both his own, as much to still his own trembling fingers as to give encouragement to Yossarian. It must be nice to be in Sweden now, he observed yearningly. The girls are so sweet, and the people are so advanced. Goodbye, Yossarian, the chaplain called, and good luck. I'll stay here and persevere, and we'll meet again when the fighting stops. So long, chaplain. Thanks, Danby. How do you feel, Yossarian? Fine. No, I'm very frightened. That's good, said Major Danby. It proves you're still alive. It won't be fun. Yossarian started out. Yes, it will. I mean it, Yossarian. You'll have to keep on your toes every minute of every day. They'll bend heaven and earth to catch you. I'll keep on my toes every minute. You'll have to jump. I'll jump. Jump, Major Danby cried. Yossarian jumped. Nately's horse was hiding just outside the door. The knife came down, missing him by inches, and he took off.